Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a quiet place where the past comes softly to life. Tonight, we travel far back in time, more than 2,000 years, to a land of wide rivers and golden fields, of great cities and endless roads. We are going to follow the life of one of the most remarkable people who ever lived. A man who began as a fierce and hardened conqueror, feared across a vast empire, and who ended his days as a seeker of peace, whose name still shines through the centuries. Here is the strange and beautiful heart of his story. After winning the greatest victory of his life, after crushing a proud kingdom and standing as master of nearly all of India, this emperor walked out onto the battlefield and wept. He looked at the ruin his own hunger for power had made, and something inside him broke apart forever. From that single day of sorrow, a warrior chose to lay down his sword and spend the rest of his life spreading kindness across the world. His name was Ashoka, and he ruled the Mauryan Empire long ago. He is remembered today not for the battles he won, but for the peace he chose. His story is one of blood and ambition, of guilt and change, of a heart that turned from darkness toward light. It is a story of stone pillars carved with gentle words, of monks sent across seas, of trees planted for shade and wells dug for thirsty travelers. It is the story of how one man tried to rule an empire not with fear, but with compassion. But before we go any further, I want to take a moment. On this channel, we explore fascinating subjects in calm and careful detail. These journeys are made to help you relax, focus, or simply enjoy the flow of discovery. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Is it day or night where you are? What time is it? Are you tuning in while studying, working, commuting, or simply winding down? Drop your answer in the comments below. It is always wonderful to hear from you. And if you enjoy content like this, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. It helps us bring you more of these journeys. Now let us go back to the very beginning, to a great city on the banks of a wide and slow-moving river. Long ago, in the northern part of India, there stood a city unlike any other in the world at that time. Its name was Pataliputra, and it rose along the southern bank of the mighty Ganges River, where the waters ran broad and brown and endless toward the distant sea. The city stretched for miles beside the river, wrapped in a great wall made not of stone but of wood, with tall timber towers standing watch at regular spaces along its length. Around the outside ran a wide and deep moat filled with water drawn from the river, so that anyone wishing to enter had to cross over guarded bridges. In the soft light of morning, the wooden walls glowed a warm brown, and the smoke of thousands of cooking fires drifted up into the pale sky. This was the heart of an empire, and it beat with the noise and life of countless people going about their days. Inside the walls, the streets were crowded from dawn until dark. Merchants laid out their goods on cloth spread across the ground, calling out to those who passed. There were baskets of rice and lentils, piles of bright spices that filled the air with sharp and earthy smells, and stacks of cloth dyed in deep reds and blues. Oxen pulled carts with wooden wheels that creaked over the packed dirt roads. Water carriers moved through the crowds with heavy clay pots balanced on their heads. The sound of it all was a steady hum, the mixing of 1,000 voices, the ringing of a coppersmith's hammer, the low bellow of cattle, and always beneath it, the soft and endless murmur of the great river flowing by. To stand in the middle of Pataliputra was to stand at the center of a world. Near the heart of the city rose the royal palace, the grandest building anyone had ever seen. It too was built largely of wood, but wood carved and polished until it shone. with tall pillars and wide halls and gardens filled with fruit trees and pools of still water. Peacocks walked slowly across the grounds, their feathers catching the light. Fountains sent cool water rising into the warm air. Foreign travelers who came from distant lands wrote later that this palace was more beautiful than the great palaces of Persia, more splendid than anything they had known. Within its walls lived the emperor and his family, his many wives, his sons and daughters, his advisors and servants and guards. It was a place of comfort and beauty, but also a place of secrets and quiet dangers, where power was the greatest prize of all. Beyond the palace, the city held workshops where craftsmen shaped metal and wood and clay, temples where people offered prayers, and homes where families slept crowded together in the cool of the night. The river gave the city its life. Boats came and went all day, some carrying grain from the fields upstream, others bearing goods from faraway places, and still others simply ferrying people from one bank to the other. Fishermen cast their nets in the early hours, when mist still hung over the water. Children played along the muddy edges where the river met the land. This was the world into which our story is set, a rich and busy place at the height of its glory. And to understand how it came to be so great, we must first look back at the family that built it all. The empire that ruled from Pataliputra had not always existed. It was young, as empires go, and it had risen in a single lifetime through the will of one extraordinary man. His name was Chandragupta Maurya, and he was the grandfather of Ashoka. The story of how he came to power is wrapped in legend, for he was born long ago, and the truth and the tales have mixed together over time. But most accounts agree that he came from humble beginnings, not born a prince or a king, but a young man of ordinary birth who rose through cleverness, courage, and iron determination. In a world where kings were usually born to their thrones, this was a rare and startling thing. At that time, northern India was not one land but many. There were small kingdoms and larger ones, each with its own ruler, each guarding its own borders. The most powerful of these was the kingdom of Magadha, ruled by a line of kings called the Nandas. The Nanda kings were said to be enormously wealthy, with vast armies and overflowing treasuries, but they were also said to be harsh and unloved by their people. Into this world came Chandragupta, a young man with a burning ambition to rule. He gathered followers, built an army from those who were unhappy with their rulers, and step by step he began to challenge the great powers around him. It was a bold and dangerous path, for failure meant certain death. There was also another force stirring in the world at that time, far to the northwest. The famous conqueror Alexander of Macedon had marched all the way from Greece across Persia and into the edges of India, leading his armies farther east than any Western ruler had ever gone. His arrival shook the lands of the northwest and left them unsettled after he turned back toward home. Some say the young Chandragupta even saw Alexander's armies with his own eyes and learned from watching how great forces moved and fought. Whatever the truth, the chaos left behind in the northwest gave a clever and ambitious man his chance. Chandragupta seized it, driving out the foreign garrisons and bringing those lands under his own growing power. Then he turned his eyes toward Magadha and the mighty Nandas. This was the great prize, the richest kingdom in all the land, with its capital at Pataliputra. The war that followed was long and hard, but in the end, Chandragupta triumphed. He overthrew the last Nanda king and took the throne for himself, becoming master of Magadha and founder of a new ruling family, the Mauryas. From this base, he expanded outward, conquering land after land, until his rule stretched across a huge portion of the Indian subcontinent. He even fought the successors of Alexander and made peace with them on favorable terms, gaining more territory and, some say, a marriage alliance in the bargain. By the end of his reign, Chandragupta ruled one of the largest empires the world had ever known. He had built it from almost nothing, from a young man of common birth into an emperor whose word governed millions. This was the foundation that Ashoka would one day inherit, an empire won by conquest and held by strength. But Chandragupta did not rule alone. Behind him stood a man whose mind was perhaps even sharper than his sword, a teacher and advisor whose cold wisdom helped shape the entire dynasty. To understand the machinery of power in this empire, we must now meet that man. His name was Chanakya, though he is also remembered by other names in the old stories. He was a scholar, a teacher, and above all, a master of the art of ruling. According to the legends, he had once been insulted by the proud Nanda king, and he swore that he would not rest until that king was brought down. To achieve his revenge, he sought out a young man of talent and ambition, and the young man he found was Chandragupta. Chanakya became his guide and his teacher, molding the rough young warrior into a ruler, and together the two of them plotted the fall of the Nandas and the rise of a new empire. Where Chandragupta brought courage and force, Chanakya brought patience, cunning, and a deep understanding of how power truly worked. Chanakya is most famous for a book he is said to have written, a work about statecraft and the running of a kingdom. This book was a guide for rulers on how to hold and use power. It covered nearly everything a king might need to know. It described how to manage the treasury and collect taxes, how to organize an army and wage war, how to appoint officials and keep them honest, and how to gather secret knowledge through networks of spies. It was practical and clear-eyed, sometimes shockingly so, for it did not pretend that ruling was a gentle business. It taught that a wise king watched everyone, trusted few, and always thought several steps ahead of his enemies. The world of the book was one of cold logic. It advised the king to place informers throughout the land, in the markets and the temples, and even within the palace itself, so that no plot could grow without his knowledge. It described how to test the loyalty of ministers, how to reward good service and punish disloyalty, and how to keep the common people content enough that they would not rise in anger. Nothing was left to chance. Every part of the kingdom, from the farmer in his field, to the merchant in his shop, to the soldier at the border, was to be watched, ordered, and guided by the will of the ruler and his officials. This was the vision of government that lay at the heart of the Mauryan state. It may sound harsh to our ears, and in many ways it was, but it was also a system built to bring order out of chaos, to hold a huge and varied land together under a single rule. Before the Mauryas, this part of the world had been a patchwork of warring kingdoms, and life for ordinary people had often been uncertain and dangerous. The strong hand of the Mauryan government, guided by the cold wisdom of Chanakya's teaching, brought a kind of peace, even if it was a peace enforced by watchful eyes and firm punishment. This was the machinery of power that Ashoka would one day command, a well-built engine of government designed to keep an emperor in control. Chanakya served not only Chandragupta, but helped guide the early years of the empire as it settled into strength. His ideas outlived him, passed down and studied by those who ran the state for generations. When we later see Ashoka managing his vast realm, with its officials and its spies and its careful records, we are seeing the long shadow of Chanakya's mind still shaping the world. But the founder, Chandragupta, did not rule forever. In time, he grew old, and according to some old traditions, he gave up his throne entirely in his later years to follow a life of quiet devotion. The crown then passed to his son, and it is to that son we now turn. The son of Chandragupta was named Bindusara, and he became the second emperor of the Mauryan line. He was Ashoka's father, though his own story is far less known to us than those of the men on either side of him. His father was the great founder, and his son would become the great emperor, and Bindusara stands between them like a bridge, holding together what one had built and passing it on to the other. Yet this was no small task. To hold a vast empire together, to keep its many parts loyal, and to defend its borders was work that demanded strength and skill. Bindusara did this for many years, and under his rule, the empire remained strong and even grew. The old stories say that Bindusara pushed the borders of the empire further, especially toward the south, extending Mauryan power over new lands and peoples. He kept up relations with the great kingdoms far to the west, the successor states of Alexander's empire, exchanging messengers and gifts with distant rulers. One charming old tale tells that Bindusara once wrote to a foreign king, asking him to send sweet wine, dried figs, and a wise philosopher. The foreign king sent the wine and the figs, but replied that philosophers were not for sale. Whether the story is true or not, it gives us a small glimpse of a curious and worldly ruler, connected to lands far beyond his own borders. Within the palace at Pataliputra, Bindusara lived surrounded by his family. He had many wives, as was the custom for emperors of that age, and from them came many children. He had a great number of sons, and these sons were the princes of the empire, each one a possible heir to the throne someday. This was both a strength and a danger. Many sons meant many capable men to help govern the far corners of the realm, sent out as young governors to distant cities. But many sons also meant many rivals, each one aware that only one of them could rule when their father died. Beneath the calm surface of palace life ran a quiet current of competition and watchfulness. The court itself was a world of ceremony and careful manners. There were grand halls where the emperor received visitors and heard petitions, seated upon a throne while officials and nobles stood in their proper places. There were feasts and celebrations, music and dancing, and the constant coming and going of servants, guards, and messengers. But there were also the quieter rooms where real decisions were made, where advisors whispered counsel, and where the endless business of ruling was carried out. For the children of the emperor, growing up in such a place meant learning early that everything was watched, that alliances mattered, and that the love and favor of their father was a prize worth competing for. It was into this world of wealth and beauty and hidden tension that Ashoka was born. He was one of Bindusara's many sons, and in his earliest years there was little sign that he would rise above the others to become one of the greatest rulers in all of history. He was simply one prince among many, growing up in the shadow of the great palace, learning the ways of the court, and watching the world of power turn around him. The story of his childhood, like much of his early life, comes to us mixed with legend, but those legends tell us something important about the boy he was said to have been. And so we turn now to the birth and childhood of the future emperor. The old traditions say that Ashoka was not his father's favorite son. In fact, some of the stories tell us that Bindusara found the boy hard to love. It was said that Ashoka was not handsome, that his skin was rough and his appearance plain, and that this made his father cool toward him, while favoring his more pleasing brothers. Whether this is truly how it happened, we cannot know for certain, for these tales were written down long after the events they describe. But they paint a picture of a boy who grew up feeling somewhat set apart, not the golden favorite, but the overlooked one. And perhaps this shaped the fierce and determined spirit that he showed as he grew older. A child who must fight for attention often grows into an adult who fights for everything. What the stories agree upon is that young Ashoka had a strong and forceful nature from an early age. He was clever, bold, and unafraid, with a will that was hard to bend. Even as a boy, he showed signs of the sharp mind and the iron determination that would later carry him to the throne. He was skilled in the things that a prince was expected to master, quick to learn and eager to prove himself. Where his gentler brothers might hang back, Ashoka pressed forward. There was in him a hunger to be more than he was, to rise above the place his father seemed to have set for him, and this hunger burned quietly beneath his everyday life in the palace. Life for a royal child in Pataliputra was a mix of great comfort and great expectation. Ashoka would have grown up surrounded by servants who tended to his every need, in rooms cooled by the shade of the palace and softened by fine cloth and cushions. He would have eaten well, dressed in good garments, and never known hunger or want in the way that ordinary children did. But he would also have known the weight of expectation from his earliest days. A prince was not simply a child to be indulged. He was a future leader, a possible ruler, and everything he did was watched and measured. His lessons, his behavior, his skills, all of these were noted by those around him, and all of them mattered. The palace was a place of many people and few true friends. Among his brothers, there was the constant awareness that they were rivals as much as family. Among the servants and officials, there was the knowledge that loyalty could shift, that today's ally might become tomorrow's enemy. A wise child learned early to watch and listen, to keep his own thoughts hidden, and to judge carefully whom he could trust. If the old stories are right, that Ashoka felt overlooked by his father, then he may have learned these lessons more sharply than his more favored brothers, developing a watchful and calculating side that would serve him well in the dangerous years ahead. Yet we should not imagine his childhood as entirely cold. There would have been moments of joy as well, of play in the palace gardens, of games with his brothers and sisters, of festivals and celebrations that filled the city with color and sound. There would have been the wonder of watching the great river, of seeing merchants arrive from distant lands, of hearing tales of the empire his grandfather had built. A curious and intelligent boy would have drunk all of this in, storing away knowledge and impressions that would shape the man he became. The world he grew up in was vast and rich and endlessly interesting, and Ashoka was a boy well suited to notice and remember it. As he grew older, the time came for his real education to begin in earnest. A Mauryan prince was not raised to be idle. He was raised to rule, and that meant learning a great many things, from the arts of war to the arts of government. The training was hard and demanding, meant to forge a soft child into a hard and capable leader. And in this training, Ashoka would begin to show just how remarkable he truly was. Let us now follow the young prince into the years of his learning, when the raw talents he was born with were shaped and sharpened into the skills of a future king. The education of a prince in the Mauryan world covered many subjects, for a ruler needed to be skilled in both mind and body. Ashoka would have learned to ride horses and to handle the great war elephants that formed a proud part of the army. He would have trained with weapons, learning to use the bow, the sword, and the spear. spending long hours until his aim was true and his arm was strong. Hunting was part of this training too, for it taught a young man courage, patience, and skill, and it was also a favored sport of kings and princes. In the forests and open lands around the capital, Ashoka would have ridden out with hunters and guards, tracking game and testing his nerve against wild and dangerous animals. But a prince needed more than strength of arm. He needed a trained and disciplined mind. Ashoka would have studied the ways of government, learning how taxes were gathered, how officials were appointed, and how justice was carried out. He would have learned about the many parts of the empire, its provinces and cities, its roads and rivers, and the peoples who lived within its borders. He would have been taught the lessons of statecraft that Chanakya's teachings had made famous, the cold and careful wisdom of holding power. And he would have learned about the beliefs and customs of his people, the many gods they worshipped, the priests and holy men who guided their spirits, and the traditions that shaped their daily lives. The training was strict, meant to build not only skill but character. A future ruler had to learn self-control, to master his temper, and to think clearly even under pressure. He had to learn to command others, to speak with authority, and to carry himself with the dignity of a leader. These were not easy things for a young man to master, and the teachers who trained the princes were demanding. Mistakes were corrected sharply, and laziness was not allowed. For a boy like Ashoka, with his strong will and his hunger to prove himself, this hard training may have suited him well. He had the drive to push himself, to work harder than others, and to excel where his brothers might have grown tired or careless. As the years passed, Ashoka's talents became clear to those who watched him. He showed a gift for leadership, a natural ability to command respect and to make others follow him. He was decisive, able to make choices quickly and firmly, and he had the courage to act when action was needed. He was also intelligent, quick to grasp difficult ideas, and to see the deeper patterns in the swirl of court life and the running of the empire. These were exactly the qualities that a great ruler needed, and even though he was not his father's favorite, they did not go unnoticed. In a family full of capable princes, Ashoka was beginning to stand out. There was also, according to the old stories, a hardness in him, a willingness to be firm and even harsh when he judged it necessary. This was not seen as a fault in the world of that time. A ruler was expected to be strong, to punish disorder, and to strike fear into those who might challenge his power. The soft ruler was thought to be a weak ruler, one who would soon lose control of his realm. Ashoka had the strength and the will to be firm, and this too marked him as a promising leader. In later years, before his great change of heart, this hardness would show itself in the way he ruled and in the wars he fought. By the time he reached young manhood, Ashoka was a capable and formidable prince. He had mastered the skills of war and the arts of government, and he carried himself with the confidence of one born to lead. But talent alone was not enough to secure a future in the dangerous world of the court. A prince needed to prove himself in the real work of ruling, to show that he could handle power and responsibility far from the comfort of the palace. And so the time came for Ashoka to be sent away from Pataliputra, out into the empire, to take up his first true post of command. This journey would be the beginning of his rise, and we follow him now as he leaves the capital of his childhood behind. The place Ashoka was sent to govern was a great city called Ujjain, which lay far to the southwest of the capital, in the central part of the empire. It was an important city, rich and busy, a center of trade and learning, sitting along the routes that carried goods across the land. To be made the governor of such a place was a mark of trust and a test of ability. It meant leaving behind the familiar halls of Pataliputra and taking on the real weight of rule, managing a province, keeping order, collecting taxes, and answering for the well-being of thousands of people. For a young prince eager to prove himself, it was a golden chance to show what he could do. The journey to Ujjain was long, carrying Ashoka far from the river city of his birth, across the wide lands of the empire. He would have traveled along the great roads with a company of guards and servants, passing through countryside that changed as he went, from the green and watered plains near the Ganges to drier and more open lands further south and west. He would have seen villages and towns, farmers working in their fields, and travelers moving along the roads. Each day carried him further from his childhood and closer to his new life as a ruler in his own right. It was a passage from boyhood into the full responsibilities of a man and a prince of the empire. When he arrived at Ujjain, Ashoka took up the duties of governor. He now sat in the seat of authority, the representative of the emperor in this part of the realm. The officials of the province reported to him, and the ordinary business of government passed through his hands. He had to settle disputes, oversee the collection of taxes, maintain the roads and public works, and keep the peace. If trouble arose, whether from bandits, from unrest among the people, or from threats along the borders, it was his job to deal with it. This was no easy work, and it demanded all the skills he had learned in his years of training. But Ashoka proved equal to the task. In Ujjain, the young prince showed that he could rule well. He managed the province with firmness and skill, keeping order and seeing to the needs of the state. He learned the practical lessons that no classroom could teach, the daily grind of governing real people in a real place, with all its problems and challenges. He learned how to work with officials, how to judge whom to trust, and how to make the hard decisions that leadership required. Each success added to his reputation, and each challenge overcome made him a stronger and more capable ruler. The overlooked prince was becoming a man of proven worth, and word of his ability would surely have reached back to the capital. His time in Ujjain was also a chance to see a different part of the empire and to understand more fully the vast and varied land he might one day rule. He saw peoples and customs different from those of the capital, and he learned how a great empire was held together, not by one city alone, but by many, each connected to the center by roads and officials and the shared authority of the emperor. This wider view would serve him well in the years to come. For a ruler who understood only his own capital could never truly govern a realm that stretched across so many lands. Ashoka was gaining the knowledge and experience of a true emperor in the making. While he governed Ujjain, another chapter of his life unfolded, one of a very different kind. But before we come to that, there is another famous story from his years as a young prince, a tale of a distant and troubled city that he was sent to bring back under control. This story shows another side of his growing reputation, his skill not only at governing peacefully, but at calming a region in revolt. It took him far to the northwest, to one of the great cities of the empire, and it added greatly to the name he was building for himself. Let us follow him now on that difficult mission. The city was called Taxila, and it lay in the far northwest of the empire, near the edge of the mountains, in a region that had long been a crossroads of peoples and cultures. Taxila was famous as a center of learning, a place where scholars gathered and where students came from far away to study. But it was also a restless region, distant from the capital and hard to control. where the people were proud and not always willing to bow easily to the rule of Pataliputra. According to the old stories, at some point during the reign of Bindusara, the city of Taxila rose in revolt, refusing to obey the officials sent to govern it. The peace of the empire was threatened, and the emperor needed someone capable to restore order. The task fell to Ashoka. He was sent to the troubled northwest to put down the uprising and bring the region back under control. It was a difficult and dangerous mission, for a rebellion in such a distant and proud region could easily turn into a long and bloody war. But according to the legends, when Ashoka approached Taxila, something remarkable happened. The people of the city did not fight him. Instead, they came out to meet him and explained that their quarrel had never been with the emperor himself, but with the harsh and corrupt officials who had been misgoverning them. They welcomed Ashoka rather than resisting him, and the revolt was settled without the terrible bloodshed that many had feared. Whether the story happened exactly as the legends tell it, we cannot be sure, but it points to a real truth about Ashoka's ability as a leader. He was able to calm a troubled region, to restore order where others had failed, and to do it with skill and judgment. Perhaps he listened to the grievances of the people and addressed the true causes of their anger. Perhaps he replaced the corrupt officials and governed more fairly. Whatever the details, he succeeded where the situation had seemed dangerous and difficult, and this success added greatly to his reputation. He was becoming known as a prince who could handle the hardest tasks the empire could throw at him. The mission to Taxila also showed Ashoka more of the vast empire he served and might one day rule. The Northwest was a world unto itself, shaped by its position at the meeting place of many roads and many peoples. Here the influences of distant lands mixed with those of India, for this was the region through which armies and traders had passed for ages, carrying goods and ideas across great distances. Ashoka would have seen a rich and varied world, different again from both the capital and from Ujjain, and this deepened still further his understanding of the empire's true nature. A land so vast and so varied was a great treasure, but also a great challenge to hold together. Having settled the trouble at Taxila, Ashoka returned to his duties, his name now carrying even greater weight. He had proven himself both as a governor who could rule in peace and as a troubleshooter who could restore order in a crisis. Among the many sons of Bindusara, he was emerging as one of the most capable and impressive. This mattered greatly, for the question of who would one day inherit the throne hung always in the background of palace life. Every success brought Ashoka closer to that great prize, and every proof of his ability made him a stronger candidate to rule when his father was gone. But that day was still ahead, and other parts of his life were unfolding in the meantime. Among the most important of these was a relationship that brought warmth and tenderness into the story of a man so often defined by ambition and war. During his time in the region of Ujjain, Ashoka met a woman who would become deeply important to him and to the story of Buddhism itself. Her story softens the picture of the hard young prince, showing us that he was also a man capable of love and family. Let us pause now in the busy account of his rise to power and turn to this gentler chapter, the story of the woman of Vidisha. Her name was Devi, and she came from the town of Vidisha, which lay in the region near Ujjain, where Ashoka served as governor. She was not a princess or a woman of royal blood. According to the traditions, she was the daughter of a merchant, a woman of a respected trading family, but not of the ruling class. When Ashoka met her during his time in the region, the two of them formed a bond, and Devi became his wife or his companion, sharing part of his life during those years away from the capital. Their union was not the sort of grand political marriage that emperors and princes usually made, arranged for alliances and advantage. It seems instead to have been a match of genuine affection, a quieter and more personal kind of bond. Devi gave Ashoka 2 children, a son and a daughter, and these two would grow up to play a great and lasting role in the story of Buddhism. The son was named Mahinda, and the daughter was named Sanghamitta. In later years, long after the events we are now describing, these 2 children would carry the teachings of the Buddha across the sea to a distant island, planting the faith in new soil where it would flourish for centuries to come. But all of that lay far in the future. For now, they were simply the children of Ashoka and Devi, born during those years in the region of Ujjain, growing up in the warmth of a family before the great changes that would sweep through their father's life. The story of Devi gives us a rare and precious glimpse of Ashoka as a private man, not the conqueror or the emperor, but simply a person who loved and was loved, who had a family and shared his days with them. It reminds us that even the greatest figures of history were human beings, with hearts that could be touched and homes that could be filled with the ordinary joys of family life. In the busy town near Ujjain, far from the intrigues of the capital, Ashoka lived for a time a life that was in some ways simpler and gentler than the one that lay ahead of him. It is a small and tender scene in a story otherwise full of great events. Devi herself is said to have been devoted to the teachings of the Buddha, which were already known and followed by some people in that part of the empire. If this is true, then it is possible that Ashoka first heard something of the Buddha's ideas through her, planting a seed in his mind that would lie quiet for many years before it finally grew. In the years of his conquest and his early rule, those gentle teachings would be far from his thoughts. But later, when his heart was broken by the horror of war, they would return to him, and perhaps the memory of Devi and her faith would be part of what drew him toward the path of peace. We cannot know for certain, but it is a beautiful thread to imagine running through his life. For reasons that the old stories do not fully explain, Devi did not go with Ashoka when he later rose to the throne and returned to the capital. She seems to have remained behind in the region of Vidisha, while her children eventually took up the great mission that would make them famous. Perhaps she preferred the quieter life of her home region to the grandeur and danger of the imperial court. Perhaps there were reasons of politics or custom that kept her from becoming the chief queen of the empire. Whatever the truth, her part in Ashoka's personal life belonged mostly to these earlier years, before the storm of events that would change everything. And a storm was indeed coming. Far away in the capital at Pataliputra, the aging emperor Bindusara was growing weaker. The long reign of Ashoka's father was drawing toward its end, and with it would come the moment that every prince both hoped for and feared, the opening of the throne and the deadly contest to claim it. All the years of training, all the proofs of ability, all the quiet watching and waiting would now come to a point. The gentle chapter of family life in the region of Ujjain was ending, and the harsh world of power and succession was about to demand everything of Ashoka. Let us return now to the capital, where the old emperor lay dying. The news came, as such news always did, along the great roads of the empire, carried by swift messengers who rode day and night to bring word to the far corners of the realm. The Emperor Bindusara had fallen ill. He had ruled for many years, holding the empire together and passing it down as his own father had passed it to him. But now his strength was failing, and it became clear that his life was drawing to its close. In the palace at Pataliputra, the mood grew tense and watchful. When an emperor died, the whole balance of power shifted, and everyone at the court knew that dangerous days lay ahead. The great question that had hung quietly in the background for years was about to be answered. Who would rule next? For the many sons of Bindusara, this was the moment they had all, in their hearts, been preparing for. Each of them was a prince of the empire, and each of them knew that the throne was the greatest prize a man could win. But only one could sit upon it. The others would have to accept a lesser place, or worse. In the world of that time, a contest for the throne was rarely a peaceful thing. When there were many capable sons and no clear rule that settled who should inherit, the death of an emperor could open the door to fierce rivalry, to plots and betrayals, and sometimes to open violence between brothers. The stakes could not have been higher, for the losers in such a struggle often lost not only power, but their very lives. Where was Ashoka when the news of his father's illness reached him? He had been away from the capital, serving as a governor and proving his worth in the provinces. Now, with the throne about to become vacant, he would have understood at once that he must act. A prince who wished to rule could not sit idly by while others moved to seize power. He would need to return, to gather his supporters, and to position himself for the contest to come. The years of building his reputation and his connections would now be put to the test. All the skill, the cunning, and the firm will that he had developed would be needed as never before, for the struggle ahead would be the hardest of his life. The old stories tell us that Ashoka had a particular rival among his many brothers, an older brother who stood in his path to the throne. In the world of succession, an elder son often had a stronger claim, and this brother may have been the favored heir, the one his father had preferred. If Ashoka wished to rule, he would have to overcome this rival and any others who stood against him. The traditions differ on the details, and the tales grew more dramatic in the telling over the centuries, but they agree that the path to the throne was not smooth or peaceful. It was a hard road, walked through danger and conflict, and Ashoka would have to be ruthless to reach its end. The palace in these days would have been a place of whispered plots and shifting loyalties. Officials and nobles had to decide whom to support, knowing that they were gambling their own futures on the outcome. To back the winning prince was to rise high in his favor. To back the loser was to fall with him, perhaps to ruin or death. Spies moved through the halls, and no one could be fully trusted. Behind the calm ceremonies and the outward respect paid to the dying emperor, a fierce and silent battle was being fought for the future of the empire. Ashoka, with his sharp mind and his gift for judging people, would have been deep in this dangerous game, weighing his allies and his enemies, planning each move with care. This part of the story is one that must be told honestly, even in a quiet telling like this one. The path Ashoka walked to reach the throne was dark, marked by conflict and, if the old accounts are to be believed, by the deaths of rivals. The world he lived in was harsh, and the contest for supreme power was often deadly. To understand the man he later became, we must not look away from the man he was first. Before he was the emperor who chose peace, he was a prince who fought his way to power through a struggle that spared no one. And so we come now to the war of brothers, the fierce contest that would decide who ruled the greatest empire of the age. When Bindusara died, the empire held its breath. The great throne stood empty, and the sons of the dead emperor turned toward it, each one measuring his chances and his rivals. What followed was a struggle that the old traditions remember as fierce and bloody, a contest among brothers for the ultimate prize. It is important to understand how such a thing could happen, for it may seem strange to us that brothers would turn against one another so violently. But in the world of ancient kingship, there was often no peaceful way to decide who would rule when many claimed the right. The strongest, the cleverest, and the most determined would take the crown, and the others would be pushed aside or destroyed. The accounts that come down to us are wrapped in legend, and they grew more dramatic over the centuries as storytellers added their own touches. Some of these tales say that Ashoka had a great many brothers, and that he overcame all of them who stood in his way. Others focus on a single chief rival, the brother who had the strongest claim to the throne. The numbers and the details vary from one telling to another, and we cannot be certain which parts are history and which are exaggeration. But the core of the story is consistent, that Ashoka won the throne through a hard and violent struggle, defeating those who opposed him and clearing his path to power. It was not a peaceful or a gentle rise. We should try to understand what this meant for Ashoka as a man. He was fighting for his life as much as for his ambition, for in such a contest, to lose was often to die. The brothers who competed for the throne knew that only one of them could win, and that the winner would need to be sure that no rival remained to challenge him later. This cold logic drove the violence of these struggles. It was not simply cruelty for its own sake, but the terrible reasoning of a world where power was absolute and where a defeated rival left alive was a constant danger. Ashoka, trained in the hard wisdom of statecraft, would have understood this reasoning well, however heavy it may have weighed on him in later years. The struggle was not settled quickly. It seems to have stretched over a period of time, as Ashoka worked to overcome his rivals and to secure the loyalty of the officials, the army, and the great men of the empire. He would have needed to win battles not only of arms, but of alliances, gathering to his side those who could help him, and defeating or winning over those who opposed him. His reputation as a capable and forceful leader, built up through his years as a governor, would have served him well here. Men who wished to back a winner would have seen in Ashoka a prince likely to triumph, and this in turn helped him triumph. Success and reputation fed one another in the deadly game of succession. The old stories tell of the harshness Ashoka showed in these years, painting him as a fierce and even cruel ruler in the time before his great change. Some traditions give him a name that means something like the fierce or the wrathful Ashoka, remembering the hardness of his early reign. There are dark legends from this period, tales of a ruler who could be terrible to those who crossed him. We should treat these stories with some caution, for they may have been exaggerated by later writers who wished to make his later transformation seem all the more remarkable. The greater the darkness of his early years, the more wondrous his turn toward the light would appear. Still, there is little doubt that the young emperor was a hard and formidable man. Whatever the exact truth of these dark years, the outcome is clear. Ashoka emerged victorious from the War of Brothers. He defeated his rivals, secured his hold on power, and made himself the master of the Mauryan Empire. The great throne of Pataliputra, won by his grandfather and held by his father, now passed to him. It was a triumph, but a triumph bought with blood and struggle, achieved through the ruthless logic of a world that knew little mercy in matters of supreme power. The prince who had once felt overlooked by his father had risen above all his brothers to claim the greatest prize in the land. But the winning of the throne was only the beginning of the work of ruling, and the years just ahead would be years of consolidating his hard-won power. After the fighting was over, there followed a period that the old accounts describe as a gap between the death of Bindusara and the formal crowning of Ashoka. During this time, the new ruler worked to make his hold on power complete and secure. Winning the struggle for the throne was one thing, but truly settling into rule was another. There would still have been those who resented him, those who had backed his rivals, and those who watched to see whether he would prove strong enough to keep what he had seized. Ashoka needed to show that he was firmly in control, that no further challenge could hope to succeed, and that the empire was safely in his hands. This took time, patience, and the same firmness he had shown in the contest itself. During these years, Ashoka would have set about rewarding those who had supported him and dealing with those who had opposed him. He would have appointed loyal men to important posts, secured the obedience of the army, and made certain that the provinces accepted his rule. The vast machinery of government, with its officials and its spies and its records, had to be brought fully under his command. A wise ruler in his position would have moved carefully, balancing firmness with the need to win over former enemies and to knit the empire together under his leadership. Ashoka, with his sharp mind and his long experience of governing, was well suited to this delicate and demanding work of consolidation. It is worth pausing to consider the patience and cunning that this period required. It would have been tempting for a triumphant prince to rush to his crowning, to claim the glory of the throne at once. But true power lay not in the ceremony alone, but in the solid control of the empire, and this could not be won overnight. Ashoka appears to have understood this, taking the time he needed to make his position unshakable before formally taking up the crown. This restraint and foresight tell us something about the kind of ruler he was, not merely a fierce fighter, but a careful and calculating statesman, able to plan for the long term and to master his own impatience in the service of his greater goals. Slowly, over these years, Ashoka's grip on the empire tightened. The uncertainty of the succession gave way to the settled reality of his rule. Those who had doubted him came to accept him, and those who had opposed him found that his hold on power was too strong to challenge. The empire, which had held its breath at the death of Bindusara, breathed again under the firm hand of its new master. The vast realm of the Mauryas, stretching across mountains and plains and reaching toward distant seas, was now Ashoka's to command. The prince who had won the throne through struggle had become the emperor who held it through skill, and the time had come at last to mark this with the great ceremony of coronation. The coronation of an emperor was among the grandest events the ancient world could offer, a moment when all the wealth and power and majesty of the empire were put on display. For Ashoka, it was the crowning of a long and hard journey, the formal recognition that he was now the supreme ruler of the Mauryan realm. The old accounts mark this event as an important moment, sometimes noting the gap of years between his father's death and this formal crowning. When the day finally came, it would have been celebrated with all the splendor that the great capital could muster, a spectacle to impress upon everyone that a new and mighty emperor now sat upon the throne of Pataliputra. We can imagine the scene, though the details come to us mixed with legend. The great city would have been filled with people, the streets crowded with those who came to witness or to celebrate. The palace would have shone with wealth, its halls decorated and prepared for the ceremony. There would have been priests to perform the sacred rites, for the crowning of a king was a holy occasion as well as a political one, blessed by the traditions and the gods of the land. There would have been music, the deep sound of drums and the bright notes of horns and the chanting of prayers. And at the center of it all would have been Ashoka himself, taking up the symbols of imperial power before the assembled great men of the realm. In this moment, Ashoka stood at the height of his worldly power. He was the master of a vast empire, commander of great armies, holder of overflowing treasuries, and ruler over millions of people. The throne that his grandfather had won and his father had held was now truly his, secured by his own strength and skill. All the ambition that had driven him, all the struggle he had endured, had brought him to this pinnacle. He was one of the most powerful men in the entire world, and few could rival the reach of his authority. For a man who had once been the overlooked son, passed over in his father's favor, it was a stunning achievement, the fulfillment of everything he had worked and fought for. Yet the reputation Ashoka carried in these early years was not one of gentleness or mercy. He was known as a firm and even harsh ruler, a man who had fought his way to the throne and who governed with a strong hand. The hardness that had helped him win power did not vanish when the crown was placed upon his head. He was still the fierce emperor of the old stories, ready to use force and fear to maintain his rule and to expand his empire. The great change that would transform him lay years in the future, and the man who sat upon the throne at his coronation was still very much a conqueror at heart, hungry for glory and unafraid to shed blood in its pursuit. This is an important thing to hold in mind as we follow his story. The Ashoka of these early years was not yet the emperor who chose peace. He was a powerful and ambitious ruler, molded by a hard world and a hard rise to power, carrying within him the same drive for conquest that had built his family's empire. The seeds of his later transformation may have been present, perhaps in the memory of gentle teachings heard long ago, perhaps in some quiet corner of his conscience, but they had not yet begun to grow. First, there would be more conquest, more ambition, and finally a war so terrible that it would break his heart and remake his soul. Before we reach that turning point, let us look at the empire he now ruled in all its vastness. The empire that Ashoka inherited and now commanded was one of the largest the world had ever seen. It stretched across an enormous portion of the Indian subcontinent, from the high mountains of the north to the warm lands reaching toward the southern sea, and from the deserts and river valleys of the west to the green and fertile plains of the east. Within its borders lay a great variety of lands and peoples, mountains and forests, rivers and plains, dry regions and wet, all held together under the rule of a single emperor. To govern such a realm was a task of staggering difficulty, and the fact that the Mauryas had built and held it was a testament to their skill and strength. Ashoka now stood at the head of all of it. The peoples of the empire were as varied as its lands. There were farmers who worked the rich soil of the river valleys, growing rice and grain and other crops to feed the millions who lived within the borders. There were herders who tended cattle and other animals in the open lands. There were craftsmen in the cities who worked metal and wood and cloth, creating goods of great skill and beauty. There were merchants who carried these goods along the roads and rivers, trading across vast distances and growing wealthy from the exchange. There were priests and holy men, scholars and teachers, soldiers and officials, and countless others who filled the many roles that a great and complex society required. All of them in their different ways, lived under the rule of the emperor. The cities of the empire were centers of wealth and life, and there were many of them scattered across the realm. There was the great capital at Pataliputra on the Ganges, the beating heart of the empire, the largest and grandest of all. But there were other important cities too, each a hub of trade and government in its own region. There was Ujjain, where Ashoka had served as governor, a center of commerce in the central lands. There was Taxila in the northwest, a famous seat of learning and a crossroads of peoples. There were cities along the coasts and in the fertile plains, each with its own character and its own importance. Together, they formed a network of centers through which the empire was governed, and its wealth was gathered and moved. The riches of the empire were great. The fertile land produced abundant crops, and the taxes gathered from farmers formed the foundation of the emperor's wealth. Trade brought further riches, as goods flowed along the roads and rivers, and even across the seas to distant lands. There were mines that produced metals and precious stones, forests that yielded timber and other products, and workshops that turned raw materials into valuable goods. All of this wealth flowed, in part, toward the emperor and his government, filling the treasuries that paid for the army, the officials, and the grand works that displayed imperial power. Ashoka ruled over a land of great abundance, and this wealth was the source of his strength. To grasp the sheer scale of the Mauryan world is to understand the greatness of what Ashoka commanded. This was not a small kingdom that a ruler could know from end to end, but a vast realm of many lands and countless people, reaching across distances that took weeks or months to travel. It was a world unto itself, containing within its borders an enormous variety of life and land and human activity. To hold such a realm together, to govern it and defend it, and draw wealth from it, required an extraordinary system of roads, officials, and control. In the days ahead, we will look more closely at how this vast empire was actually held together, beginning with the great roads that connected its distant parts. Across the enormous distances of the empire ran a network of roads, and chief among them was a great royal road that stretched for an immense distance, connecting the far northwest with the eastern capital and beyond. This road was one of the wonders of the ancient world, a highway that bound together the scattered parts of the realm. Along it moved everything that held the empire together: the armies that defended it, the officials who governed it, the merchants who traded across it, and the messengers who carried news from one end to the other. Without such roads, an empire of such size could not have existed, for its distant parts would have been too far away to control. The roads were the veins through which the life of the empire flowed. The great road was carefully maintained and provided with the things that travelers needed. Along its length, at regular intervals, there were wells where the weary could drink and water their animals, and there were rest houses where travelers could shelter and sleep. Trees were planted along parts of the road to give shade from the fierce sun, offering cool relief to those who walked or rode beneath the burning sky. Markers showed the distances so that travelers would know how far they had come and how far they had yet to go. These provisions made the long journeys of the empire possible, turning a mere track across the land into a true highway that people could rely upon. Later, Ashoka himself would add to these comforts as part of his reforms. Along these roads traveled a constant stream of people and goods. There were merchant caravans, long lines of carts and pack animals loaded with goods, moving slowly across the land to carry their wares from one region to another. There were officials on the business of the government, traveling to take up posts or to carry out the emperor's orders. There were soldiers marching to defend the borders or to enforce the emperor's will. And there were the messengers, the swift riders who carried news and commands across the empire, connecting the capital to its distant provinces. The flow of people along the roads never ceased, day after day, season after season, keeping the vast realm connected and alive. The system of messengers was especially important, for an emperor who could not send and receive news quickly could not truly govern a distant land. The Mauryan rulers maintained ways of carrying messages swiftly across the empire, so that news of trouble in a far province could reach the capital, and the emperor's response could be sent back as quickly as possible. This was the nervous system of the empire, the means by which the will of the ruler at the center could reach and control the distant edges of his realm. Through these messengers, Ashoka could stay informed about all parts of his empire and could send his orders wherever they were needed. It was a vital tool of imperial power. The roads and the messengers together made it possible for one man, sitting in his palace at Pataliputra, to rule a realm that stretched across an entire subcontinent. They shrank the vast distances of the empire, connecting the far corners to the center and binding the whole together into a single state. Without them, the empire would have fallen apart into separate regions, too distant to control. With them, it held together as one, governed by a single emperor and a single system of rule. This was one of the great achievements of the Mauryan world, and it was part of the inheritance that made Ashoka's power possible. But the roads were only one part of the machinery that held the empire together. Just as important was the vast system of government, the officials and spies and record keepers who ran the state. Beneath the emperor stood a great structure of government, a vast system of officials who carried out the work of ruling the empire. No single person could govern such a realm alone, and so the emperor relied upon a huge number of officials, each with their own duties and their own place in the order of things. There were high officials who governed entire provinces, standing in for the emperor in the distant parts of the realm. There were lesser officials who managed districts and towns, who collected taxes and kept order and saw to the needs of the people. And there were countless clerks and record keepers who handled the endless paperwork that a great government required. Together, they formed the body of the state, carrying out the will of the emperor throughout his lands. The system was carefully organized, with each official answerable to those above him, so that authority flowed down from the emperor through the layers of government to reach even the smallest village. Taxes were assessed and collected, and careful records were kept of what was owed and what was paid. The land itself was measured and recorded, so that the government knew what it contained and what it could produce. Trade was watched and taxed, and the flow of goods was monitored. Justice was administered, disputes were settled, and crimes were punished. All of this required a huge amount of organized effort, carried out by the many officials of the state, and all of it served to keep the empire running and to fill the emperor's treasuries. One of the most striking features of the Mauryan government was its use of spies and informers. The teachings of statecraft that had guided the founding of the dynasty placed great importance on knowledge, on knowing what was happening throughout the realm and what people were thinking and planning. To gather this knowledge, the rulers maintained networks of spies who moved throughout the empire, watching and listening and reporting back what they learned. These informers could be found everywhere, in the markets and the temples, among the merchants and the officials, and even within the palace itself. Through them, the emperor could learn of plots against him, of trouble brewing in the provinces, and of the honesty or dishonesty of his own officials. It was a system built on watchfulness and control. This careful watching extended even to the emperor's own servants and officials. A wise ruler, according to the old teachings, did not simply trust those who served him, but tested them and watched them to be sure of their loyalty and honesty. Officials who did their duty well were rewarded, while those who were corrupt or disloyal were discovered and punished. In this way, the emperor tried to keep his vast body of officials honest and effective, preventing them from abusing their power or turning against him. It was a demanding and sometimes harsh system, but it was designed to keep the great machine of government running smoothly and to keep the ultimate control firmly in the hands of the emperor. All of this careful organization, this system of officials and spies and records, gave the Mauryan emperor an extraordinary degree of control over his realm. Few rulers in the ancient world could match the reach of the Mauryan state into the daily lives of its people. This was the machinery that Ashoka now commanded, a well-built engine of government inherited from his grandfather and father and refined over the years. With it, he could govern his vast empire, gather its wealth, maintain its order, and enforce his will across enormous distances. But the empire was not only a system of government and control, it was also a living economy, a world of farms and workshops and markets, of ordinary people working and trading and building their lives. Let us now look at that economic life, the foundation upon which all the emperor's power rested. The true wealth of the empire came from the land and the labor of its people, and above all, from its farmers. Across the fertile plains and river valleys of the realm, countless farmers worked the soil, growing the crops that fed the empire and filled its treasuries. In the rich lands near the great rivers, where the soil was watered and fertile, they grew rice and grain and many other crops. The work was hard and endless, following the turning of the seasons, the times of planting and the times of harvest. Farmers rose with the sun and worked until it set, tending their fields, guiding their oxen, and gathering their crops. Their labor was the foundation upon which the entire empire rested, for without the food they grew, nothing else would have been possible. The farmers paid a portion of their harvest to the government as taxes, and this formed the largest single source of the emperor's wealth. The land was carefully measured and recorded, and the taxes were assessed and collected by the officials of the state. This system linked the humble work of the farmer in his field directly to the grand power of the emperor in his palace, for it was the farmer's labor, gathered in through taxes, that paid for the army, the officials, and the great works of the empire. The government took an interest in farming, encouraging the clearing of new land and the building of irrigation works to water the fields. For the more the land produced, the greater the wealth that flowed to the state. In this way, the prosperity of the farmers and the power of the emperor were bound together. Beyond the farms, the empire was full of craftsmen who made goods of many kinds. In the cities and towns, workers shaped metal into tools and weapons and ornaments, wove cloth from cotton and other fibers, made pottery from clay, and crafted goods of wood and stone and other materials. These craftsmen were often organized into groups according to their trades, and they formed an important part of the life of the cities. Their skills produced the goods that people needed and wanted, from the simple tools of daily life to the fine luxuries desired by the wealthy. The markets of the cities were filled with their wares, and their work added to the wealth and the richness of the empire's life. The busy workshops were another source of the empire's strength. Trade tied all of this together and carried the empire's wealth far and wide. Merchants moved goods along the roads and rivers, buying in one place and selling in another, connecting the different regions of the empire and even reaching to distant lands beyond its borders. Grain from the fertile plains, cloth from the workshops, metals from the mines, and countless other goods flowed along the trade routes. The markets of the cities buzzed with the business of buying and selling, filled with the calls of merchants and the haggling of buyers. Goods came in from faraway places, exotic wares that spoke of distant lands and peoples. This trade brought wealth to the merchants and, through taxes, to the emperor, and it wove the many parts of the empire together into a single economic world. All of this economic life, the farming and the crafts and the trade, was the true foundation of the emperor's power. The armies that defended the empire, the officials who governed it, and the grand works that displayed its glory, all depended upon the wealth produced by the ordinary people going about their daily labor. It was easy, perhaps, for the great and powerful to forget this, to see only their own splendor, and to overlook the humble work that made it all possible. But the wealth that fed the emperor's ambitions came ultimately from the fields and the workshops and the markets, from the endless labor of millions of ordinary people. This was the living body of the empire, and upon it rested everything else. With this foundation in mind, let us return to Ashoka himself and to the early years of his reign as emperor. In the first years after his coronation, Ashoka ruled as a firm and forceful emperor, very much in the mold of his fierce reputation. He held the vast empire he had inherited with a strong hand, governing through the machinery of officials and spies and enforcing his will across his lands. He was not yet the gentle ruler of his later years, and the old accounts remember this period as a time of firm and sometimes harsh rule. He maintained the power of the state, kept order throughout his realm, and dealt sternly with any who challenged his authority. This was the way of rulers in his world, and Ashoka, hardened by his rise to power, ruled as a strong emperor was expected to rule, through strength and, when needed, through fear. The empire under his early rule was stable and powerful, held firmly together by the systems of government he commanded. He carried on the work of his father and grandfather, maintaining the great realm they had built and governing it with skill and firmness. The roads carried his messengers and his armies. The officials collected his taxes and enforced his laws, and the spies kept him informed of all that happened throughout his lands. He was, by all accounts, an effective ruler, capable and in full command of his empire. The hardness that had helped him win the throne now helped him hold it, and the vast realm of the Mauryas remained strong and united under his authority. The old traditions preserve a memory of severity in these early years, tales of an emperor who could be harsh and even cruel. There are dark legends from this period, stories that paint Ashoka as a stern and terrible ruler before his great change of heart. As we noted before, we should treat these stories with some caution, for they may have been made darker by later writers who wished to heighten the contrast with his later transformation. But there is little doubt that Ashoka in these years was a hard man, ruling a hard world with the firmness that his position demanded. He was a conqueror by nature and by upbringing, and the softer qualities that would later define him had not yet come to the surface. We should try to understand Ashoka as he was in these years, without judging him too harshly by the standards of a different age. He lived in a world where power was won and held by strength, where mercy was often seen as weakness, and where a ruler who did not command fear could not long survive. He had risen to the throne through a violent struggle, and he governed a vast and varied realm that could easily fall into disorder if his grip weakened. In such a world, firmness was not merely a personal choice, but a necessity of survival. The Ashoka of these early years was a product of his time and his circumstances, a strong ruler doing what strong rulers did, holding his empire together through the exercise of power. Yet even in these years, the seeds of his later change may have been present within him, waiting for the moment when they would begin to grow. Perhaps there were quiet doubts, moments when the cost of power weighed upon him, memories of gentler teachings heard in earlier years. We cannot know what passed through his mind in these times before the great transformation, but we know that the change, when it came, would be profound, turning the fierce conqueror into a seeker of peace. And we know what triggered it. It was a war, the last and greatest conquest of his reign, a campaign against a single proud land that had never bowed to his family's power. To understand that fateful war, we must first understand the land he set out to conquer. To the southeast of the heart of the empire, along the coast where the land met the great Eastern Sea, lay a kingdom called Kalinga. It was a proud and independent land, one that had never submitted to the rule of the Mauryas. While Ashoka's grandfather and father had conquered vast territories and brought many lands under their power, Kalinga had remained free, standing apart from the great empire that surrounded it. This independence was a source of pride to the people of Kalinga, but it was also, in the eyes of an ambitious emperor, an affront, a gap in the empire, a land that had defied the power of the Mauryas and remained beyond their grasp. For a ruler hungry for complete dominion, such a land was a temptation and a challenge. Kalinga was a rich and prosperous land, and this too drew the emperor's eye. It lay along the coast with access to the sea, and it was said to have a thriving trade, its merchants sailing to distant lands and bringing back wealth. Its position along the eastern coast made it important for the trade routes that ran by sea, linking the different regions and reaching toward faraway places. Its lands were fertile, and its people were prosperous. All of this made Kalinga a valuable prize, a land whose conquest would add greatly to the wealth and the reach of the empire. The riches of Kalinga, combined with its stubborn independence, made it a target that an ambitious conqueror could hardly ignore. The people of Kalinga were known for their fierce love of freedom and their willingness to fight for it. They had preserved their independence in a world of great and hungry empires, and they were prepared to defend it. They were a proud people, confident in their strength and their way of life, and they did not intend to bow easily to any outside power. This spirit of independence made them formidable, for a people who will fight hard for their freedom are a difficult enemy to conquer. Ashoka, in setting his sights on Kalinga, was choosing a hard target, a land that would not surrender without a bitter struggle. The war that would come would be no easy campaign, but a fierce and bloody conflict. We know something of Kalinga because Ashoka himself later wrote about the war he fought there, in words carved into stone that have survived to our own time. Through these words, we can glimpse the scale of what happened, the vast numbers of people affected by the war. But before the war, Kalinga was simply a land like other lands, filled with people living their lives. There were farmers working the fertile soil, merchants trading along the coast and across the sea, craftsmen making their goods, and families raising their children. There were towns and villages, temples and homes, all the ordinary life of a prosperous and independent people. This was the world that Ashoka's ambition would soon shatter, the peaceful life that his war would destroy. For now, though, Kalinga stood free and proud, the one land that had defied the power of the Mauryas and remained independent. To the ambitious emperor in his palace at Pataliputra, it was an unfinished piece of business, a challenge to his power, and a prize worth taking. The decision to conquer it would prove to be the great turning point of his life, though he could not have known this when he made it. He set out to win a war, to complete the conquests of his family, and to bring the last independent land under his rule. What he found instead was a horror that would break his heart and change him forever. But first, let us understand why he chose to make this fateful war. The reasons that drove Ashoka to war against Kalinga were several, mixing together the practical concerns of empire with the pride and ambition of a powerful ruler. There was the matter of trade and wealth, for Kalinga's position along the coast and its thriving commerce made it a valuable prize. Control of Kalinga would give the empire command of important trade routes and access to the riches that flowed through this prosperous land. For an emperor who understood the importance of wealth to power, this was a strong reason to desire the conquest of Kalinga. The economic value of the land made it a target worth the effort and cost of war. There was also the matter of the empire's completeness and security. Kalinga sat like a gap in the great realm of the Mauryas, an independent land surrounded by imperial territory. Its independence was not only an affront to the emperor's pride, but also a potential danger, for a free and powerful Kalinga could threaten the empire's control of the surrounding regions and its trade routes. By bringing Kalinga under his rule, Ashoka would close this gap, securing his empire and removing a possible threat. The logic of empire pushed toward the conquest of any independent land that lay within or beside its borders, for such lands were seen as threats to be removed and prizes to be won. Above all, perhaps, there was pride and ambition. Ashoka was a conqueror by nature and by heritage, the grandson of the man who had built the empire and the son of the man who had expanded it. To complete the conquest of the subcontinent, to bring under his rule the last independent land that had defied his family, would be a great achievement, a fitting crown to his reign. The desire for glory, for the fame that came with great conquests, was a powerful force in the hearts of ancient rulers, and Ashoka was no exception. Kalinga's long independence made its conquest all the more desirable, for to succeed where the challenge had long stood unmet would bring great honor and prove his greatness as a ruler. These reasons together drove Ashoka toward war. The decision to conquer Kalinga was, in the world of his time, a natural one for an ambitious and powerful emperor. It followed the logic of empire, the desire for wealth and security and glory that had driven conquerors throughout history. There was nothing unusual in it, no sign that this war would be different from the other conquests of his family. It was simply the next step in the expansion and consolidation of the empire, a campaign to bring the last free land under imperial rule. Ashoka set out upon it as he would have set out upon any war, expecting victory and the rewards that victory would bring. And yet this war would be different, though not in the way anyone expected. It would end in victory, as Ashoka intended. But the victory would prove to be a kind of defeat, a triumph so terrible in its cost that it would turn the conqueror against conquest itself. The gathering storm of this conflict, which seemed at first like just another campaign, would in fact be the great turning point of Ashoka's life and of the history of the empire. As the decision for war was made and the preparations began, neither Ashoka nor anyone else could have foreseen where it would lead. The great army of the Mauryas was assembled and made ready, and soon it would march south toward Kalinga and toward the day that would change everything. The army that Ashoka gathered for the conquest of Kalinga was a mighty force, one of the great armies of the ancient world. The Mauryan Empire was famous for the size and strength of its military, and Ashoka commanded enormous numbers of soldiers. There were foot soldiers by the thousands, armed with weapons and shields, forming the great mass of the army. There were horsemen, mounted warriors who could move swiftly across the land. There were chariots, and above all, there were the war elephants, the great beasts that were the pride and terror of Indian armies. These huge animals, trained for battle, could smash through enemy lines and spread fear among those who faced them. Together, these forces made up a war machine of tremendous power. When this great army set out for Kalinga, it must have been an awesome sight. The long columns of soldiers stretched far along the roads, marching in their thousands toward the south. The war elephants moved among them, huge and slow and powerful, their great feet shaking the ground. The horsemen rode alongside, and the chariots rolled behind. Behind the fighting forces came the vast train of those who supported the army, the carriers of supplies, the tenders of animals, and all the many people needed to keep such a force fed and equipped on its long march. The dust raised by so many feet and hooves would have risen in great clouds, and the noise of the marching host would have carried far across the land. The march toward Kalinga was long, carrying the great army across the countryside toward the coastal land in the southeast. Day after day the soldiers marched, following the roads and crossing the rivers, moving steadily toward their target. Along the way, they would have passed through towns and villages, and the people who lived there would have watched in awe and fear as the mighty host went by. An army of such size was a fearsome thing, and its passing was an event that people would long remember. The soldiers themselves, marching toward war, would have carried a mix of feelings: the excitement of the coming battle, the hope of victory and its rewards, and perhaps the quiet fear that always accompanies those who march toward danger and possible death. For the soldiers, the long march was a time of hardship and endurance. They walked for many miles each day, carrying their weapons and their gear, sleeping in camps at night and rising to march again at dawn. The sun beat down upon them, and the roads were hard beneath their feet. They ate the food that the supply train provided, drank from the wells and rivers along the way, and rested when they could. It was a hard life, the life of a soldier on the march, demanding strength and endurance and discipline. But these were experienced troops, the soldiers of a great empire, and they were used to the demands of campaigning. They marched onward toward Kalinga, following their emperor's will toward the war that awaited them. At the head of this great host, or directing it from the capital, was Ashoka himself, the emperor whose ambition had set the whole vast machine in motion. It was his will that had gathered the army and sent it marching south, his desire for conquest that would soon be tested against the fierce resistance of the people of Kalinga. He expected victory, as he had every reason to, for his army was mighty and his power was great. He could not have known that this war, unlike his other campaigns, would change him forever. As the great army approached Kalinga, the stage was set for a terrible clash, one that would bring untold suffering to the land and would break the heart of the conqueror who had set it in motion. But the people of Kalinga were not waiting idly for their doom. They were preparing to fight. In Kalinga, as word came of the approaching Mauryan army, the people made ready to defend their homeland. They were a proud and independent people, and they had no intention of surrendering their freedom without a fight. Across the land, men took up arms, preparing to face the great host that was marching against them. They were farmers and craftsmen and merchants, ordinary people transformed into soldiers by the threat to their homeland, joined by the trained warriors who defended the kingdom. They gathered their weapons, they organized their forces, and they prepared to make a stand against the invaders. The spirit of the people of Kalinga was fierce, and they were determined to defend everything they held dear. We should try to see these defenders as the real human beings they were, not merely as figures in a distant tale. They were people with homes and families, with lives they loved and a land they cherished. They had children to protect, parents to honor, and a way of life they were not willing to give up. As they prepared for war, they must have felt the mix of feelings that all people feel when danger comes: the fear of what was to come, the anger at the invaders who threatened them, and the fierce determination to defend their home. They knew that the enemy was powerful, that the odds were against them, but they chose to fight rather than to submit. This was courage of a high order, the courage of a people defending their freedom. The preparations for war would have filled the land with activity and tension. Weapons were gathered and made ready, and men trained and organized themselves for the coming battle. Defenses were prepared, and plans were made for how to meet the invading army. In the towns and villages, families said their farewells as their men went off to fight, not knowing whether they would return. There was fear in the air, the fear that comes when a great enemy approaches, but there was also resolve, the determination to resist and to defend. The people of Kalinga steeled themselves for the ordeal ahead, drawing on their pride and their love of freedom to face the mighty force that was coming against them. The defenders of Kalinga faced a daunting task. The Mauryan army was one of the greatest military forces in the world, vast in number and strong in every kind of fighting. Against such a foe, the people of Kalinga, however brave and determined, were at a great disadvantage. They were fewer in number, and they lacked the resources of the mighty empire. Yet they did not despair or surrender. They chose to fight, to defend their homeland against overwhelming odds, to resist the conqueror even in the face of likely defeat. This choice, this refusal to submit without a struggle, speaks to the depth of their love for their freedom and their homeland. They would rather fight and possibly die than give up their independence without resistance. As the two forces drew closer, the tension mounted toward the terrible clash that was coming. On one side was the great army of the Mauryas, mighty and confident, marching to complete the conquests of the empire. On the other side were the people of Kalinga, fewer but fierce, determined to defend their homeland to the last. Both sides were preparing for a battle that would be fought with all the strength and courage they could muster. The land itself seemed to hold its breath as the moment of conflict approached. Soon the two armies would meet, and the peaceful land of Kalinga would become a field of war and death. The battle that followed would be one of the most terrible events of the age, and it would change the course of history. Let us now turn to that dreadful day. The two armies met near the Daya River in the land of Kalinga, and there they fought a battle so terrible that its memory would echo through the ages. This part of the story is one that must be told honestly, even in a quiet telling like this one, for it was a day of great suffering and death. The Mauryan army, vast and powerful, fell upon the defenders of Kalinga, and the people of Kalinga fought back with all the fierce courage of those defending their homeland. The clash of the two forces was violent and bloody, a scene of chaos and horror as thousands upon thousands of men struggled and fought and died. The peaceful land beside the river became a place of unspeakable carnage. We can only imagine the scene. though Ashoka's own later words tell us of its terrible scale. The air would have been filled with the sounds of battle, the clash of weapons, the cries of men, the trumpeting of the war elephants, and the thunder of the fighting. The great beasts of the Mauryan army would have charged into the ranks of the defenders, smashing and trampling. The foot soldiers of both sides would have met in fierce, close combat, striking and falling. The ground would have grown wet with blood, and the fallen would have lain thick upon the field. It was a scene of horror beyond easy description, the terrible reality of ancient war in all its brutality and suffering. The beautiful land beside the dire river was transformed into a place of death. The people of Kalinga fought bravely, but the might of the Mauryan army was too great. Despite their courage and their determination, the defenders could not overcome the overwhelming force that Ashoka had brought against them. The battle went against them, and their resistance, however fierce, was gradually broken by the superior numbers and strength of the invaders. Yet they did not give up easily. They fought on, defending their homeland with desperate courage, selling their lives dearly in defense of their freedom. The battle was long and terrible, and the cost in lives was staggering on both sides, but especially among the people of Kalinga, who were fighting for their very existence as a free people. The numbers that Ashoka himself later recorded are almost beyond belief in their horror. He wrote that in the war against Kalinga, a vast number of people were killed, and many more times that number died from other causes connected to the war, and a great multitude were taken away as captives. The scale of the death and suffering was enormous, affecting not only the soldiers who fought, but the ordinary people of the land whose lives were destroyed by the war. Whole families were shattered, homes were ruined, and a prosperous and peaceful land was drenched in blood and grief. The victory that Ashoka won was bought at a price so terrible that even he, the conqueror who had sought it, would come to see it as a horror rather than a triumph. When the fighting finally ended, the Mauryan army stood victorious upon the field. Ashoka had won the war he had set out to fight. Kalinga was conquered, its resistance broken, its independence ended. The last free land had fallen under the power of the empire, and the emperor had achieved the conquest he had desired. By the measures of the world he lived in, it was a great triumph, the completion of his family's conquests and the crowning achievement of his reign. But the cost of this victory lay all around him, in the countless dead upon the field, in the ruined land, in the grief and suffering that the war had brought. And it was in the aftermath of this terrible victory that the great change in Ashoka would begin. First, though, we must look upon the field after the fighting and the full cost of what had been done. When the battle was over and the dust had settled, the true cost of the victory lay revealed across the land. The field beside the dire river was covered with the dead and the dying, a scene of horror that stretched as far as the eye could see. The bodies of the fallen lay thick upon the ground, the soldiers of both armies and the people of Kalinga who had risen to defend their homeland. The cries of the wounded filled the air, the moans of men in pain, calling for help or for water or for the mercy of death. The ground was soaked with blood, and the smell of death hung heavy over everything. This was the true face of the victory that Ashoka had won. Not glory and triumph, but suffering and death on a massive scale. Beyond the battlefield itself, the whole land of Kalinga lay stricken by the war. The prosperous and peaceful kingdom had been shattered. Towns and villages had been ruined, and the ordinary life of the land had been destroyed. Families had lost their fathers and sons, their husbands and brothers, in the terrible fighting. Many who had not died in battle had died from the hardships that war brought, from hunger and sickness and the collapse of ordinary life. And a great multitude of people had been taken away as captives, torn from their homes and their families to face lives of servitude far away. The suffering spread far beyond the battlefield, touching nearly every family in the conquered land. The war had brought a tide of grief and misery that washed over the whole of Kalinga. We should pause to consider the human reality of this suffering, for it is easy to speak of such things in numbers and to lose sight of what they truly meant. Each of the fallen had been a living person, with a name and a family, with hopes and fears, and a life that was now ended. Each captive taken away was a person torn from everything they knew, facing a future of misery. Each ruined home had been a place where a family had lived and loved. The great numbers that Ashoka recorded that represented an ocean of individual human suffering, of grief multiplied countless times over. This was the true cost of the conquest, measured not in the glory of victory, but in the shattered lives of the people of Kalinga. The land itself bore the scars of the war. Fields that had grown crops now lay trampled and ruined. The wells and the trees, the homes and the temples, all bore the marks of the violence that had swept through. Where there had been the busy life of a prosperous people, there was now desolation and grief. The war had not only killed and captured people, but had torn apart the very fabric of life in Kalinga, leaving behind a broken and suffering land. It would take a long time for the land to recover, for the wounds of such a war to heal, if they could ever fully heal at all. The victory had left behind a legacy of ruin and sorrow that would linger long after the fighting had ended. This was the aftermath of the conquest of Kalinga, the terrible price of Ashoka's victory. He had achieved his goal, but the achievement was drenched in blood and grief. The land he had conquered was a land of the dead and the suffering, a testament to the horror of what he had done. And it was in the midst of this scene of desolation that the great change in Ashoka's heart would begin. For when the emperor came to look upon the field of his victory, when he saw with his own eyes the terrible cost of his conquest, something within him would break. The conqueror who had sought glory would find only horror, and from that horror would come a transformation that would change him and his empire forever. Let us now follow Ashoka as he walks among the dead. The old accounts tell us that after the battle, Ashoka went out to look upon the field of his victory, and what he saw there changed him forever. He walked among the dead and the dying, across the ground where his great victory had been won, and he beheld the terrible cost of his conquest. He saw the countless bodies of the fallen, the soldiers and the people of Kalinga who had died in the fighting. He heard the cries of the wounded, the moans of the dying, the weeping of those who had lost everything. He saw the ruined land, the shattered lives, the ocean of suffering that his war had caused. And as he looked upon all of this, the full weight of what he had done came crashing down upon him. Something broke within the heart of the conqueror. Ashoka had gone to war expecting the glory of victory, the satisfaction of completing his conquests and proving his greatness. But standing there amid the carnage, he found no glory, no satisfaction, only horror and grief. The reality of what he had done overwhelmed him. All the death, all the suffering, all the destruction had been caused by his own ambition, his own desire for conquest and power. He had brought this horror upon a peaceful people, had shattered their lives and their land, all for the sake of adding another territory to his empire. The enormity of it struck him with terrible force, and the hard heart of the conqueror began to crack and break. In that moment, According to the traditions, Ashoka was seized by a profound sense of sorrow and remorse. The suffering he saw before him was not an abstract thing, not a matter of numbers in a report, but a living reality that he witnessed with his own eyes. He saw the human cost of his war, the individual grief and pain multiplied countless times over, and it filled him with a horror and a sorrow deeper than anything he had ever felt. He, who had been a hard and fierce ruler, unafraid to shed blood in pursuit of his goals, found himself undone by the sight of what his own actions had wrought. The conqueror wept, and in his weeping was the beginning of a transformation that would remake his soul. This was the great turning point of Ashoka's life, the moment when the conqueror began to become the seeker of peace. It was not a sudden and complete change, but a beginning, the first cracking open of a heart that had been hard and closed. The sight of the suffering at Kalinga planted in him a seed of remorse and questioning that would grow in the days and months and years that followed. He began to ask himself terrible questions. Was this what victory meant? Was this the price of glory and conquest? Could any prize be worth such suffering? These questions would haunt him, driving him toward a new understanding of his life and his purpose, away from the path of conquest and toward the path of peace. We can imagine the emperor standing there upon the field, a powerful man brought low by the sight of what he had done. All his power, all his armies, all his wealth and glory seemed suddenly hollow and meaningless in the face of so much suffering. What did it profit a man to conquer a land if the conquest brought only death and grief? What was the worth of an empire built upon such horror? These were the questions that began to stir in Ashoka's heart as he looked upon the ruin of Kalinga. The great victory he had won had become, in that moment, a great defeat, a defeat of everything he had believed about power and conquest and the purpose of a ruler's life. And from this defeat, a new man would slowly be born. The change that began at Kalinga did not leave Ashoka in peace. In the days and nights that followed, he was tormented by what he had seen and what he had done. The old accounts tell of an emperor consumed by guilt and unrest, unable to find comfort or ease. The images of the battlefield haunted him, the countless dead, the suffering of the people, the ruin of a peaceful land. He could not forget what he had witnessed, and he could not escape the knowledge that he himself had caused it. The remorse that had begun on the field of Kalinga grew and deepened, becoming a constant companion that gave him no rest. The powerful emperor, master of a vast empire, was tormented in his own heart by the weight of his guilt. The nights, we may imagine, were especially hard. In the quiet dark, when the business of the day was done and there was nothing to distract him, the memories would return. He would see again the faces of the dead, hear again the cries of the wounded, remember again the sorrow he had caused. Sleep, when it came, may have brought no relief, only troubled dreams of the horror he had unleashed. He was a man haunted, unable to find peace, tormented by a conscience that had awakened to the terrible cost of his actions. All his power could not free him from this torment, for it came from within, from the awakening of his own moral sense to the enormity of what he had done. This inner struggle marked a profound shift in Ashoka. Before Kalinga, he had been a conqueror who saw war and conquest as the natural business of a great ruler, who valued glory and power above all. Now he found himself questioning everything he had believed. The suffering he had caused weighed upon him, and he could no longer take the old pride in his conquest and his power. He began to search for a different way, for some path that would give him peace and would let him make sense of his life and his actions. His torment was driving him toward a search for meaning, for a new understanding of how he should live and rule. The guilt that consumed him was also, in a strange way, opening him to change, to the possibility of becoming a different kind of man. In his search for peace, Ashoka would have turned to the wise men and teachers of his realm, seeking answers to the questions that tormented him. In his empire, there were many who claimed to offer wisdom and guidance, teachers of various faiths and philosophies who spoke of how a person should live and how to find peace of mind. Among these were the followers of the Buddha, whose teachings spoke of compassion, of the avoidance of harm to all living things, and of a path to inner peace through right living and right understanding. These teachings, which he may have first encountered in earlier years, now began to speak to his troubled heart, offering him a way out of his torment and a new vision of how to live. The transformation of Ashoka was thus born out of suffering, out of the horror of Kalinga and the guilt that followed. It was the awakening of a conscience, the birth of remorse in a heart that had once been hard. This inner struggle, painful as it was the beginning of something remarkable, the turning of a conqueror toward the path of peace. Out of the darkness of his guilt, Ashoka was reaching toward the light, searching for a new way to live and to rule. The teachings of the Buddha, with their message of compassion and non-harm, would provide the guidance he sought, leading him step by step toward the profound change that would define the rest of his life. Let us now follow how those teachings began to reach and heal his troubled mind. The teachings that would transform Ashoka came from the Buddha, a great teacher who had lived and taught in the lands of India some centuries before Ashoka's own time. The Buddha had taught a path of compassion and wisdom, of avoiding harm to all living things, and of finding peace through right understanding and right living. His teachings spread among the people over the generations, carried by monks and followers, and by Ashoka's time they were known and practiced in parts of the empire. These ideas, so different from the harsh logic of conquest and power, now began to reach the troubled mind of the emperor, offering him a message that spoke directly to his suffering and his search for peace. At the heart of the Buddha's teaching was the idea of compassion, of caring for the suffering of all living beings and wishing to ease it rather than to cause it. This was a message that struck deeply at a man tormented by the suffering he had caused at Kalinga. The Buddha taught that harming others brought harm to oneself, that the path to peace lay in kindness and in the avoidance of violence and cruelty. For Ashoka, who had caused so much suffering and who now suffered himself from the guilt of it, this message offered both an explanation for his torment and a way out of it. If he could turn from causing harm to easing it, from violence to compassion, perhaps he could find the peace that eluded him. The teachings also spoke of the causes of suffering and the way to overcome it. The Buddha had taught that suffering came from craving and desire, from grasping after things, and from the endless hunger for more. This too would have spoken to Ashoka, whose hunger for conquest and power had led him to the horror of Kalinga. His craving for glory, for the completion of his empire, had brought about terrible suffering, both for others and for himself. The Buddha's teaching offered a different way, a path of letting go of such cravings, of finding contentment and peace through a different way of living. For a man whose ambition had led him to ruin, this was a powerful and healing message. As these ideas reached Ashoka's mind, they began to offer him a new way of seeing his life and his actions. Where before he had seen conquest as glory, he now began to see it as harm and suffering. Where before he had valued power and dominion above all, he now began to value compassion and the avoidance of harm. The teachings of the Buddha gave him a new framework for understanding what he had done and for imagining how he might live differently. They offered him not only comfort in his torment, but a whole new vision of how a person, and even an emperor, ought to live. This was the first light entering the darkness of his guilt, the beginning of the path that would lead him out of his suffering and toward a new life. The teachings did not transform Ashoka all at once. It was a gradual process, a slow turning of his heart and mind as the ideas took root and grew within him. He would have needed to learn more, to reflect deeply, and to be guided by those who understood the teachings well. But the seed had been planted, or perhaps a seed planted long before had finally begun to grow. The message of compassion and non-harm, of peace through right living, spoke to his deepest needs in his hour of torment. It offered him a way forward, a path out of the darkness and toward the light. To follow this path, though, he would need teachers and guides, wise men who could lead him deeper into the understanding and practice of the Buddha's way. Let us now meet those who helped guide him. As Ashoka turned toward the teachings of the Buddha, he came into contact with the monks and teachers who followed and spread that path. These were men who had devoted their lives to the Buddha's way, who had given up ordinary life to pursue wisdom and compassion and to teach others. They lived simply, owning little, spending their days in study and meditation, and in teaching those who came to them. They were the keepers of the Buddha's teachings, the ones who preserved and passed on his message from generation to generation. It was these gentle and wise men who now helped guide the troubled emperor along the path he had begun to walk, teaching him the way of the Buddha and helping him to understand and to practice it. The traditions tell of particular teachers who influenced Ashoka, wise monks who spoke to him and helped to guide his transformation. One story tells of a young monk whose calm and peaceful manner deeply impressed the emperor, showing him the peace that the Buddha's teaching could bring. Another tells of a wise elder who instructed him in the teachings and helped to deepen his understanding and commitment. Whatever the exact details, it is clear that Ashoka was guided by teachers who helped him along his path, who taught him the ways of the Buddha and helped him to grow in his new faith. These quiet voices, so different from the voices of war and conquest, now spoke to the emperor and helped to reshape his heart. The wisdom these teachers offered was gentle and profound. They spoke of compassion for all living beings, of the avoidance of harm, of the finding of peace through right living and right understanding. They taught by their example as much as by their words, showing in their own calm and peaceful lives the fruits of the path they followed. For Ashoka, tormented by guilt and searching for peace, the presence of such men would have been a source of great comfort and guidance. Here were people who had found the peace he sought, who lived by the very principles that could heal his troubled heart. Their gentle wisdom moved him and drew him further along the path he had begun to walk, deepening his commitment to the way of the Buddha. These monks and teachers represented a way of life utterly different from the world of power and conquest that Ashoka had known. They sought not wealth or dominion or glory, but wisdom and peace and the easing of suffering. They harmed no living thing, treated all beings with compassion, and lived simply and humbly. This example must have been a revelation to Ashoka, showing him that there was another way to live, another set of values by which a person could order their life. The contrast between their peaceful way and the violence of his own past would have struck him deeply, drawing him ever more strongly toward the path they represented. In these quiet men, he saw the possibility of a different and better way of being. Under the guidance of these teachers, Ashoka's transformation deepened and took firmer root. He was no longer merely a tormented man reaching toward a comforting idea, but a serious seeker being guided along a well-marked path by those who knew it well. He was learning the teachings of the Buddha, growing in his understanding and his commitment, and being shaped by the gentle wisdom of his guides. The change that had begun on the field of Kalinga was becoming a true and lasting transformation, a genuine turning of his heart and life toward the way of peace and compassion. This transformation would soon reach its fullness as Ashoka fully embraced the teachings of the Buddha and committed himself to following the Buddhist path. Let us now witness that turning of his heart. The transformation of Ashoka reached its fullness when he truly embraced the teachings of the Buddha and committed himself to following the Buddhist path. This was the great change at the center of his story, the moment when the fierce conqueror became a devoted follower of a path of peace. It was not a change forced upon him by others, but one that came from within, from the awakening of his conscience at Kalinga and the healing wisdom of the teachings he had embraced. Ashoka gave himself to the way of the Buddha, adopting its principles as the guide for his life and his rule. The man who had once sought glory through conquest now sought peace and virtue through compassion and right living. This turning of the heart represented a profound shift in everything that Ashoka valued and pursued. Before, he had valued power, wealth, and glory, and he had been willing to shed blood to obtain them. Now, he valued compassion, virtue, and the avoidance of harm, and he committed himself to a life guided by these principles. The change touched the very core of his being, transforming not only his beliefs, but his whole way of seeing the world and his place in it. He had been a warrior and a conqueror. He would now become a seeker of peace and a promoter of virtue, dedicating his power and his position not to conquest, but to the well-being of his people and to the spreading of the values he had come to embrace. The old accounts describe how Ashoka became a devoted follower of the Buddha's way, drawing ever closer to the teachings and the community of monks who followed them. He is said to have grown deeply committed to the path, studying the teachings, supporting the monks, and striving to live according to the principles he had embraced. His transformation was not a matter of words alone, but of action and commitment, of ordering his life and his rule according to his new understanding. He had found, in the teachings of the Buddha, both the peace he had sought in his torment and a new purpose for his life and his power. The change was genuine and deep, and it would shape everything he did in the years that followed. We should appreciate how remarkable this transformation truly was. Here was one of the most powerful men in the world, the master of a vast empire, a conqueror at the height of his power. He had everything that ambition could desire, wealth and dominion and glory. And yet he turned away from the path of conquest, renouncing the very things that most rulers sought above all. He chose instead the path of peace and compassion, dedicating his power to the well-being of others rather than to his own glory. Such a change in such a man was extraordinarily rare. Most conquerors, having tasted victory, hunger for more. Ashoka, having tasted the horror of victory, turned away from it forever. This was the profound shift at the center of his story. The transformation of Ashoka would have consequences far beyond his own life and soul. As the ruler of a vast empire, his change of heart would reshape the way he governed and the direction of his rule. The values he had embraced would become the principles by which he sought to rule his people, and the faith he had adopted would be spread and promoted throughout his lands and beyond. A personal transformation became a force that would touch millions of lives and would echo through the centuries. But before we follow how Ashoka's new faith reshaped his empire, let us pause to understand more fully the teachings he had embraced, the life and message of the Buddha that had so profoundly changed him. For to understand Ashoka's new path, we must understand the teacher whose way he now followed. The Buddha had lived some centuries before Ashoka in the lands of northern India, and his life and teachings had given rise to the path that Ashoka now followed. He had been born, according to the traditions, as a prince, the son of a ruler, raised in comfort and shielded from the hardships of the world. But as a young man, he had ventured beyond the walls of his sheltered life and had encountered the realities of suffering, seeing sickness, old age, and death. These sights troubled him deeply and set him on a search for understanding, for a way to make sense of suffering and to find release from it. He gave up his princely life and became a seeker, wandering and studying and striving to find the truth. After a long search, the Buddha attained what his followers called enlightenment, a deep and complete understanding of the nature of suffering and the way to overcome it. He came to understand, according to the teachings, that suffering was a fundamental part of life, that it arose from craving and desire, and that it could be overcome by following a path of right living and right understanding. This understanding was the heart of his teaching, the truth that he then spent the rest of his life sharing with others. He taught that by letting go of craving, by living virtuously and cultivating wisdom and compassion, a person could find release from suffering and attain a state of peace. This was the essence of the Buddha's message, simple in its outline yet profound in its depth. The path that the Buddha taught was one of moderation and virtue, of avoiding extremes and following a middle way. It included living ethically, avoiding harm to others, speaking truthfully, and acting rightly. It included the cultivation of the mind through meditation and reflection, developing calm and clarity and insight. And it included the growth of wisdom, the deep understanding of the nature of things. Central to it all was compassion, the caring for the suffering of all living beings and the wish to ease it. The Buddha taught that all living things deserve compassion, that harming them brought harm, and that kindness and non-harm were essential to the path. This emphasis on compassion and non-harm would become central to Ashoka's own vision of how to live and to rule. The Buddha taught these things not as a distant and forbidding master, but as a guide who had walked the path himself and who sought to help others find the peace he had found. He gathered followers around him, both monks who devoted their lives fully to the path and ordinary people who followed it while living their everyday lives. He taught for many years, traveling and sharing his message, until at last he died at a great age. But his teachings lived on, preserved and passed down by his followers, spreading through the generations. By Ashoka's time, these teachings had become an established path, followed by monks and lay people alike, offering a way of peace and compassion in an often harsh and violent world. This was the faith that Ashoka embraced. Understanding the Buddha's teaching helps us to understand the transformation of Ashoka and the direction his rule would now take. The emphasis on compassion, on the avoidance of harm to all living beings, on virtue and right living, would become the foundation of Ashoka's new vision for his empire. He would seek to rule according to these principles, to promote them among his people, and to spread them far and wide, The gentle wisdom of the Buddha, which had healed his troubled heart, would now become a force shaping the government of a vast empire. This was something new in the world, a ruler seeking to govern according to the principles of compassion and non-harm. Let us now see how Ashoka turned these principles into a new way of ruling. Out of his transformation and his embrace of the Buddha's teachings, Ashoka developed a new vision for how he would rule, centered on an idea he called Dhamma. This word, Dhamma, meant something like a moral way of life, a set of principles for right living that Ashoka wished to promote among all his people. It was not exactly the same as the Buddhist teaching alone, though it was deeply influenced by it. Rather, it was a broad moral code that Ashoka hoped could guide the lives of all his subjects, whatever their particular faith. It emphasized virtues such as kindness, honesty, respect for others, care for living things, and the avoidance of harm. Through the promotion of Dhamma, Ashoka hoped to make his empire a more moral and compassionate place. This idea of Dhamma represented a remarkable blending of kingship with conscience. Ashoka came to believe that the true purpose of a ruler was not merely to hold power and to expand his dominion, but to promote the moral and material well-being of his people. He saw himself as a kind of father to his subjects, responsible for their welfare and their moral guidance. This was a very different vision of kingship from the one he had held before, when he had ruled as a conqueror seeking glory and power. Now he sought to rule as a moral guide and a protector of his people's well-being, using his position and his authority to promote virtue and to ease suffering. It was a new and noble vision of what a ruler could be. Ashoka worked to spread the principles of Dhamma throughout his empire in many ways. He sought to lead by example, ruling according to the principles he promoted and showing his people the way of virtue through his own conduct. He appointed officials whose task was to promote Dhamma among the people and to see that its principles were followed. And he communicated his teachings directly to his people through messages that he had proclaimed and, most famously, carved into stone across his empire. Through all these means, he sought to make Dhamma a living force in the lives of his subjects, to shape a society guided by moral principles and compassion. It was an ambitious and unprecedented effort to govern an empire according to a moral vision. The vision of Dhamma also shaped Ashoka's approach to the many different faiths and peoples within his empire. Rather than favoring one faith and suppressing others, Ashoka promoted a spirit of tolerance and respect among the different religions of his realm. He encouraged people to respect one another's beliefs and to avoid quarrels over religion. This was a wise and generous policy, fitting for a ruler who governed a vast and varied empire containing many faiths and peoples. It reflected the compassion and the respect for others that lay at the heart of his moral vision. Ashoka understood that a peaceful and harmonious society required tolerance and mutual respect, and he worked to promote these among his people. The idea of Dhamma was thus the heart of Ashoka's new way of ruling, the practical expression of his transformation from conqueror to moral leader. It represented his attempt to bring the principles of compassion and virtue into the government of his empire, to rule not through fear and force, but through moral guidance and care for his people. This was a vision of kingship far ahead of its time, a bold experiment in governing according to conscience. To spread this vision to all his people, across the vast reaches of his empire, Ashoka turned to a remarkable method. He had his messages carved into stone, on rocks and pillars across his lands, so that his words would reach his people and would endure for ages to come. Let us now turn to these famous edicts carved in stone. To spread his message of Dhamma throughout his vast empire, Ashoka turned to a remarkable and enduring method. He had his words carved into stone, onto great rocks and tall pillars placed across his lands, so that his message could reach his people and could last for generations. These carved messages are known today as the Edicts of Ashoka, and they are among the most precious treasures that have come down to us from the ancient world. Through them, we can hear the voice of Ashoka himself, speaking across more than 2,000 years, telling us of his thoughts, his beliefs, and his hopes for his people. They are a window into the mind and heart of a remarkable ruler, preserved in stone for all time. The choice of stone was a wise one, for stone endures where other materials fade and decay. Words written on paper or cloth would have been lost long ago, but words carved into rock could survive for ages, weathering the passing of the centuries. Ashoka wished his message to last, to reach not only his own people, but the generations that would come after. By carving his words into stone, he ensured that they would endure, and indeed they have, surviving to our own time, when so much else from that distant age has been lost. The great rocks and pillars, standing across the lands of the empire, became permanent monuments to his message, speaking to all who passed by, then and for centuries to come. The edicts were placed in many locations across the empire, so that Ashoka's message could reach people in all parts of his vast realm. Some were carved onto great natural rocks, on the faces of boulders and cliffs where people would see them. Others were carved onto tall pillars, columns of polished stone that Ashoka had raised for this purpose. These were placed in important locations, along the roads, near the towns and cities, at holy places, wherever people would gather or pass by. In this way, the message of Dhamma was spread across the whole empire, reaching people in distant provinces as well as in the heart of the realm. The edicts brought the emperor's words directly to his people, wherever they lived. There was something truly bold in this idea of an emperor speaking directly to all his people through carved messages. Most rulers of that age communicated only with their officials and nobles, and their words reached the common people only indirectly, if at all. But Ashoka wished to speak directly to everyone, to reach the ordinary people with his message of virtue and compassion. Through the edicts, he addressed his subjects as a father addressing his children, sharing his thoughts and his hopes, urging them toward right living, and telling them of his own efforts and beliefs. This direct communication between an emperor and his people was something new and remarkable, a sign of the personal and moral vision that guided Ashoka's rule. The edicts reveal much about Ashoka and his transformation. Through them, we see a ruler deeply concerned with the moral and material well-being of his people, committed to the principles of compassion and virtue, and honest even about his own past mistakes. They show us a man who had truly changed, who had turned from conquest to compassion, and who sought to use his power for the good of his people. They are the enduring testament of his transformation, carved in stone so that it could never be forgotten. In the days ahead, we will explore what these edicts actually said, the message of Dhamma that Ashoka wished to spread. Let us now turn to the content of the rock edicts and hear the heart of his teaching. The rock edicts carried Ashoka's message of Dhamma to his people, and their content reveals the heart of what he wished to teach. In them, he called upon his people to live virtuous and compassionate lives, to treat one another with kindness and respect, and to avoid causing harm to living things. He urged them to honor their parents, to respect their teachers and elders, and to be kind to their friends, their servants, and even to animals. He spoke of the importance of honesty, of truthfulness, and of right conduct in all things. Through these messages, Ashoka sought to promote a moral way of life among his people, to encourage them toward virtue and compassion in their daily lives. One of the central themes of the edicts was the avoidance of harm to living things. Ashoka, deeply influenced by the Buddhist principle of compassion for all beings, urged his people to refrain from killing and harming animals. He spoke of reducing the killing of animals for food and for sacrifice, and of treating all living creatures with kindness and care. This concern for the welfare of animals, as well as of people, was a striking feature of his teaching, reflecting the deep compassion that lay at the heart of his transformed values. In an age when the killing of animals was common and taken for granted, Ashoka's call for kindness to all living things was a remarkable and gentle message. The edicts also emphasized the importance of tolerance and respect among the different faiths and peoples of the empire. Ashoka urged his subjects to respect one another's beliefs, to avoid quarrels over religion, and to honor the good in all faiths. He himself, though a follower of the Buddha's way, showed respect for other religions and encouraged harmony among them. This message of tolerance was wise and generous, fitting for a ruler of a diverse empire, and it reflected the compassion and respect for others that guided his vision. He understood that a peaceful society required mutual respect and understanding, and he used the edicts to promote these values among his people. Through the edicts, Ashoka also spoke of his own efforts and his own commitment to Dhamma. He described the good works he had undertaken for the welfare of his people, the officials he had appointed to promote virtue, and his own dedication to ruling according to moral principles. He shared his thoughts and his hopes, speaking to his people in a personal and direct way. This was not the cold voice of a distant ruler issuing commands, but the warm voice of a leader who cared for his people and wished to guide them toward a better way of life. The edicts reveal a ruler deeply engaged with the moral well-being of his subjects, sharing his own journey and urging them to join him on the path of virtue. The content of the rock edicts brings us close to the heart of Ashoka's teaching and his transformation. In them, we hear his voice, gentle and earnest, urging his people toward kindness, compassion, honesty, and respect. We see the values that had come to guide his life and his rule, the principles of the Buddha's way translated into a message for all his people. These messages, carved into stone across the empire, spread the vision of Dhamma far and wide, reaching people in all parts of the realm. But the rock edicts were not the only monuments that Ashoka raised to carry his message. He also erected great pillars, towering columns of polished stone, crowned with carved animals, that stood among the most beautiful and remarkable works of the ancient world. Let us now turn to these magnificent pillars. Among the most magnificent of Ashoka's creations were the great pillars he raised across his empire, towering columns of stone that carried his message and displayed the glory of his rule. These pillars were remarkable works of craftsmanship, tall shafts of stone, carefully cut and polished, until they shone with a smooth and gleaming surface. They rose high into the sky, standing far above the people who gathered around them, visible from a great distance. At the top of each pillar sat a carved capital, often in the form of one or more animals, beautifully sculpted from stone. These pillars were among the finest achievements of the art of the age, monuments of great beauty and skill that spoke of the power and the vision of the emperor who raised them. The making of these pillars was a task of extraordinary difficulty and skill. Each pillar was cut from a single great block of stone, an enormous shaft that had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and raised into place. The stone was polished to a remarkable smoothness, a gleaming finish that has amazed those who have seen it ever since. The carved capitals at the top, with their finely sculpted animals, showed the highest level of artistic skill. All of this required great resources, skilled craftsmen, and careful organization, the kind that only a powerful and wealthy empire could provide. The pillars stand as a testament not only to Ashoka's vision, but to the skill and achievement of the craftsmen of his empire. Like the rock edicts, many of the pillars carried Ashoka's messages carved into their surfaces. The pillar edicts, as they are known, conveyed his teachings of Dhamma to the people, urging them toward virtue and compassion, and sharing his thoughts and his efforts. Placed in important locations across the empire, these pillars brought his message to the people while also serving as beautiful monuments to his rule. They combined the practical purpose of communication with the display of imperial glory and the creation of works of lasting beauty. Standing tall and gleaming, carrying the emperor's words and crowned with their carved animals, the pillars were among the most striking features of the Mauryan world. We can imagine these pillars rising across the land, gleaming in the sunlight, visible from afar. Travelers along the roads would have seen them from a distance, tall columns catching the light, and would have approached them to read or to hear the messages they carried. At holy places and important sites, they stood as markers of the emperor's presence and his message, beautiful and imposing. For the people of the empire, these pillars would have been objects of wonder, magnificent works of art and monuments to the power and the vision of their ruler. They brought together beauty, meaning, and imperial glory in a way that few other monuments of the ancient world could match. The pillars of Ashoka have endured, in part, to our own time, and they remain among the most treasured monuments of ancient India. Their beauty, their craftsmanship, and their historical importance have made them famous, studied and admired by all who learn of them. They are enduring symbols of Ashoka's rule and his vision, standing as they have for more than 2,000 years. Among them, one in particular has become the most famous of all, a carved capital of 4 lions that has become a symbol of India itself. This remarkable work of art deserves our special attention, for it connects the ancient world of Ashoka to the modern nation of India. Let us now turn to the famous lions of Sarnath. The most famous of all Ashoka's monuments is the carved capital that once crowned a pillar at a place called Sarnath, a site holy to Buddhists as the place where the Buddha was said to have first taught his message. This capital, carved from stone, is a masterpiece of ancient art, and it has become one of the most recognized symbols of India in our own time. It shows 4 lions, seated back to back, facing outward in the 4 directions. The lions are carved with great skill and power, their forms strong and majestic, their manes and features rendered in fine detail. Beneath them are other carved figures and forms, and the whole capital is a work of remarkable beauty and craftsmanship. The 4 lions, facing outward in all directions, carried a meaning fitting for the emperor who raised them. They spoke of power and of the reach of the emperor's message in all directions, across the whole of his vast empire. Placed at Sarnath, the holy site of the Buddha's first teaching, the capital connected the power of the emperor with the spreading of the Buddha's message, the 2 great themes of Ashoka's transformed rule. The lions, strong and majestic, represented both the might of the empire and the strength of the teaching that Ashoka now promoted. It was a fitting monument for a ruler who had turned his power to the service of a message of peace and virtue. The craftsmanship of the lion capital is truly remarkable, a testament to the skill of the artists and craftsmen of Ashoka's empire. The lions are carved with a strength and a realism that bring them to life, their forms full of power and dignity. The details of their manes, their faces, and their bodies show the high level of artistic skill that the craftsmen possessed. The other figures and forms carved into the capital are equally fine, showing the same mastery of the art of stone carving. The whole work is polished to the same gleaming smoothness that marked Ashoka's pillars, adding to its beauty. It is a work that has amazed and delighted all who have seen it, standing among the finest achievements of ancient Indian art. The lion capital of Sarnath has taken on a special meaning in modern times, connecting the ancient world of Ashoka to the nation of India today. When India became an independent nation, the lion capital was chosen as the national emblem, a symbol of the country and its heritage. Thus, the work that Ashoka raised more than 2,000 years ago lives on, honored as a symbol of a great modern nation. This remarkable continuity connects the ancient emperor to the India of today, showing how his legacy endures across the vast span of time. The lions that Ashoka raised still stand, in a sense, at the heart of the nation, a lasting reminder of his rule and his vision. The fame of the lion capital reminds us of the enduring power of Ashoka's monuments and his legacy. Long after his empire fell and his name was forgotten for a time, the works he created endured, and in time they were rediscovered and honored anew. The lions that once crowned a pillar at Sarnath have become a symbol recognized across the world, connecting the present to the distant past. They are a fitting emblem of a ruler whose legacy has proved so enduring, whose influence has reached across more than 2,000 years. But the monuments were not the only remarkable thing about how Ashoka communicated with his people. There was also the matter of language, of how he chose to speak to his subjects in words they could understand. Let us now consider this thoughtful aspect of his rule. One of the thoughtful features of Ashoka's edicts was the language in which they were written. Rather than using only the scholarly or sacred languages known to priests and learned men, Ashoka had his messages written in the everyday languages that ordinary people spoke and could understand. This was a deliberate choice, reflecting his wish to reach all his people, not just the educated few. He wanted the common people, the farmers and craftsmen and merchants, to be able to understand his message of Dhamma, and so he had it written in the languages they knew. This care in the choice of language shows the depth of his concern for reaching and guiding all his people, whatever their station in life. The empire that Ashoka ruled was vast and varied, containing many different peoples who spoke many different languages. To reach all of these people, Ashoka had his edicts written in different languages and scripts in different parts of the empire, using the forms that the local people could understand. In the northwest, where different languages and scripts were used, the edicts were written accordingly, while in other regions they were written in the forms known there. This adaptation of his message to the languages of different regions shows a remarkable care and thoughtfulness, a genuine effort to reach every part of his diverse empire. Ashoka did not simply issue his message in one form and expect all to understand, but adapted it to the needs of his varied people. This choice of everyday languages reflected the personal and direct nature of Ashoka's communication with his people. He was not speaking only to scholars and officials, but to everyone, addressing his subjects directly with his message of virtue and compassion. By using the languages they spoke, he made his message accessible to all, ensuring that even ordinary people could understand what he wished to tell them. This was in keeping with his whole approach to rule, his vision of himself as a father to his people, concerned with the well-being and the moral guidance of all his subjects. The care he took to speak to his people in their own languages shows the sincerity and the depth of this concern. The languages and scripts of Ashoka's edicts have also proved to be of great value to those who study the ancient world. Because the edicts were written in the everyday languages of the time, they give us precious knowledge of those languages and of how they were written. When scholars in later ages worked to understand the edicts, they had to decipher these ancient scripts, unlocking the meaning of the messages that Ashoka had left. This work of decipherment was an important achievement, opening a window into the ancient world and allowing the voice of Ashoka to be heard again after long ages of silence. The languages that Ashoka chose to reach his people have thus become a bridge across time, connecting us to his distant age. The care that Ashoka took in the language of his edicts is a small but telling detail that reveals much about the kind of ruler he was. It shows his genuine concern for reaching and guiding all his people, his wish to communicate directly and clearly with everyone, and his thoughtfulness in adapting his message to the needs of his diverse subjects. It is a detail that brings us close to the character of the man, showing his sincerity and his care. Among the edicts that Ashoka left, there is one that is especially remarkable, one in which he speaks with extraordinary honesty about his sorrow over the war he had fought at Kalinga. This edict reveals the depth of his transformation more clearly than any other. Let us now turn to this remarkable confession carved in stone. Among all the edicts that Ashoka left, one stands out for its extraordinary honesty and its emotional depth. In this edict, Ashoka spoke openly of the war he had fought at Kalinga and of the deep sorrow and remorse he felt for the suffering it had caused. He recorded the terrible cost of the war, the vast numbers of people killed, the many who died from other causes, and the great multitude taken away as captives. And he confessed that the thought of this suffering weighed heavily upon him, filling him with sorrow and regret. This was a remarkable thing for a ruler to do, to admit publicly, in words carved into stone for all to see, his own sorrow and remorse over a war he had fought and won. The honesty of this confession is truly rare in the history of rulers. Most kings and emperors have sought to glorify their conquests, to celebrate their victories, and to hide or excuse their failures and their crimes. But Ashoka did the opposite. He took his greatest military victory, the conquest of Kalinga, and he spoke of it not with pride, but with sorrow and regret. He acknowledged the terrible suffering he had caused, and he expressed his remorse for it openly before all his people. This was an extraordinary act of honesty and humility, a public confession of regret from a man who had every worldly reason to boast of his triumph. It reveals the depth and the sincerity of his transformation more clearly than almost anything else. In this edict, Ashoka explained how the horror of Kalinga had turned him toward the path of Dhamma. He described how the suffering he had witnessed had filled him with sorrow and had led him to embrace the way of virtue and compassion. He declared that he now wished to win people over not through force and conquest, but through the promotion of Dhamma, through moral guidance and the example of right living. He expressed his hope that his descendants would refrain from further conquests, and that if they must conquer, they would value the conquest through Dhamma above the conquest by arms. In this way, the edict connected the horror of Kalinga directly to his transformation, showing how his greatest triumph had become the source of his deepest change. This remarkable confession shows us the true depth of Ashoka's transformation. It was not a shallow or a merely political change, a matter of appearances or convenience. It was a deep and genuine turning of the heart, born of real sorrow and real remorse. Ashoka truly regretted the suffering he had caused, and this regret drove him toward a new way of ruling and living. The honesty with which he confessed his sorrow, carving it into stone for all to see and for all ages to remember, speaks to the sincerity of his change. He did not hide from what he had done, but faced it openly, acknowledging his fault and dedicating himself to a better path. This is the mark of a truly transformed soul. The confession of Kalinga, carved in stone, stands as one of the most moving documents to survive from the ancient world. In it, we hear the voice of a ruler speaking with rare honesty about his own sorrow and remorse, and we witness the depth of a transformation that turned a conqueror into a seeker of peace. It is a testament to the reality and the power of change, to the possibility that even a hardened warrior can turn from violence to compassion, from conquest to care for others. This honesty and this transformation lay at the heart of everything Ashoka did in the years that followed, as he worked to build an empire guided by moral principles. To carry out this vision, he created special officials whose task was to promote virtue among the people. Let us now turn to these officers of righteousness. To carry out his vision of Dhamma throughout his empire, Ashoka created a special class of officials whose task was to promote virtue and moral living among the people. These officials, sometimes called the officers of Dhamma, were charged with spreading the message of virtue, encouraging people to live rightly, and seeing to the well-being of the people in various ways. They were a new kind of official, unlike the tax collectors and administrators of the ordinary government, for their concern was not with the collection of revenue or the enforcement of law, but with the moral and material welfare of the people. Through them, Ashoka sought to make the promotion of virtue a part of the work of government itself. The duties of these officers were varied and reflected the breadth of Ashoka's concern for his people. They worked to promote the principles of Dhamma, encouraging people toward kindness, honesty, respect, and compassion. They looked after the welfare of various groups of people, seeing to the needs of the old, the poor, and those who required help. They worked to ensure fair treatment and to prevent wrongful suffering, looking into the conditions of people and seeking to ease their hardships. They promoted harmony among the different faiths and peoples of the empire, encouraging tolerance and mutual respect. In all these ways, they served the moral and material well-being of the people, carrying out Ashoka's vision of a caring and compassionate government. The creation of these officers represented something remarkable in the history of government. Here was an empire in which conscience and moral concern had become part of the official machinery of the state. The government was concerned not only with power, revenue, and order, but with the virtue and the well-being of the people. Officials were charged with promoting kindness and compassion, with caring for the vulnerable, and with encouraging right living. This was a vision of government as a force for moral good, a means of promoting virtue and easing suffering. It was far ahead of its time, an early example of a ruler using the power of the state to promote the welfare and the moral improvement of the people. Through these officers, Ashoka's vision of Dhamma reached into the daily lives of his people across the vast empire. The officials traveled through the land, promoting virtue, looking after the welfare of the people, and carrying out the emperor's wishes. They were the human agents of his moral vision, bringing his principles to life in the many regions and communities of the realm. Through their work, the abstract idea of Dhamma became a living force, touching the lives of ordinary people and shaping the character of the empire. Ashoka's transformation had thus become more than a personal matter. It had become a program of government, a systematic effort to build a more virtuous and compassionate society throughout his lands. The officers of righteousness show us how seriously Ashoka took his vision of a moral government. He did not merely proclaim his principles and hope that people would follow them. He created the means to promote and carry out those principles, appointing officials dedicated to the task and giving them real duties and real authority. This practical, organized approach reflects the mind of a capable ruler, applying his administrative skill to a new and noble purpose. The same emperor who had once commanded armies now commanded officers of virtue, turning the machinery of his empire from conquest toward compassion. This was but one of the many ways in which Ashoka sought to improve the lives of his people. He also undertook practical works for their comfort and welfare, building things that would ease the lives of ordinary people. Let us now turn to these public works. Among the practical works that Ashoka undertook for the welfare of his people were the many things he built to ease the lives of travelers and ordinary folk. He had wells dug along the roads so that travelers and those who lived nearby would have water to drink. In a hot land where water was precious, these wells were a great blessing, offering relief to the thirsty and making travel easier and safer. He had trees planted along the roads so that their shade would offer relief from the fierce heat of the sun. Travelers walking or riding under the burning sky could rest beneath these trees, cooled by their shade. And he had rest houses built, shelters where travelers could stop and rest on their long journeys. These works reflected Ashoka's genuine concern for the comfort and welfare of ordinary people. He thought not only of grand matters of state and religion, but of the everyday needs of his subjects, of the traveler weary on the road, of the thirst that needed quenching, of the shade that offered relief from the sun. This attention to the ordinary comforts of life shows the practical and caring side of his rule. He wished to ease the hardships of his people's lives, to make their daily existence a little easier and more pleasant. The wells, the trees, and the rest houses were humble things compared to the great pillars and edicts, but they touched the lives of ordinary people in direct and practical ways, offering real relief and comfort. Ashoka himself spoke of these works in his edicts, recording what he had done for the welfare of his people. He described the planting of trees, the digging of wells, and the building of rest houses, done so that people and animals might benefit. He mentioned these works with a quiet pride, not as boasts of grandeur, but as accounts of care for his people. This attention to practical welfare was part of his whole vision of Dhamma, of a ruler concerned with the well-being of his subjects. It showed that his transformation was not merely a matter of belief and proclamation, but of concrete action, of real works done to ease the lives of the people. His compassion was expressed not only in words, but in wells dug and trees planted and shelters built. The care that Ashoka showed for travelers reflected the importance of travel and trade in his vast empire. Along the great roads, people were constantly moving, merchants with their goods, officials on the business of the state, ordinary people traveling for their own reasons. These travelers faced the hardships of the road, the heat, the thirst, the weariness of long journeys. By providing wells, shade, and rest houses, Ashoka eased these hardships, making travel safer and more comfortable. This benefited not only the individual travelers, but the whole life of the empire, for easier travel meant better trade, better communication, and a more connected and prosperous realm. Ashoka's practical works thus served both the welfare of individuals and the good of the empire as a whole. The public works of Ashoka reveal the gentle and practical side of his transformed rule. He was not content merely to proclaim lofty principles, but sought to put them into practice through concrete works that eased the lives of his people. The wells, the trees, and the rest houses stand as humble but meaningful expressions of his compassion, his genuine care for the comfort and welfare of ordinary folk. They show a ruler who thought of his people's everyday needs and who used his power to meet them. This same spirit of care extended even further to the health and healing of both people and animals. Ashoka undertook efforts to provide medicine and care for all living things, a remarkable expression of his compassion. Let us now turn to these efforts. Ashoka's compassion extended beyond the comfort of travelers to the health and healing of both people and animals throughout his empire. He undertook efforts to provide medical care, arranging for healing herbs and medicines to be made available for the treatment of the sick. In an age when illness was common and medicine was limited, this concern for the health of the people was a remarkable expression of care. Ashoka wished to ease the suffering caused by sickness, to help those who were ill, and to provide for the healing of his people. He arranged for medicinal plants to be grown and made available where they were needed, so that people could be treated for their ailments and their suffering eased. What is especially striking about Ashoka's concern for health is that it extended to animals as well as to people. In keeping with the principle of compassion for all living beings that lay at the heart of his values, Ashoka arranged for the medical care of animals as well as humans. He had healing herbs provided for the treatment of sick animals, and he showed concern for their welfare and their suffering. This care for the health of animals was a rare and remarkable thing, reflecting the depth of his compassion for all living creatures. In a world where animals were often treated with little regard, Ashoka's concern for their welfare and their healing stood out as an expression of a truly broad and deep compassion. Ashoka spoke of these efforts in his edicts, recording the provision of medical care for both people and animals. He described how he had arranged for healing herbs and medicines to be made available, and how he had provided for the treatment of the sick, both human and animal. He mentioned even the growing and importing of medicinal plants where they were needed, so that the care could reach all parts of the empire. These records show how seriously he took this concern, how it was a real and organized part of his rule. His compassion was not merely a feeling, but a policy, expressed in concrete efforts to provide healing and to ease suffering throughout his lands for all living things. The provision of medical care for people and animals reflected the whole spirit of Ashoka's transformed rule, his deep compassion and his concern for the welfare of all living things. It showed a ruler who cared not only for the power and prosperity of his empire, but for the suffering of individual beings, human and animal alike. This was compassion turned into policy, the principle of caring for all living things made real through concrete efforts. It was a remarkable expression of the values that had come to guide Ashoka's life, values born of his transformation and rooted in the teachings of compassion that he had embraced. Few rulers in history have shown such broad and deep concern for the welfare of all living beings. This concern for the welfare of animals, so central to Ashoka's compassion, also led him to change the customs of his own court and his own way of life. The killing of animals, which had once been common in the royal household and in the customs of the age, was something that troubled Ashoka's transformed conscience. In keeping with his values, he took steps to reduce the killing of animals, even changing his own habits and the practices of his court. This was a sincere expression of his beliefs, showing that he was willing to change even his own pleasures and customs in accordance with the principles he had embraced. Let us now turn to how Ashoka reduced the killing of animals and transformed the customs of his court. In keeping with his deep compassion for all living things, Ashoka took steps to reduce the killing of animals throughout his empire, and even change the customs of his own court. The killing of animals had long been common, for food, for sacrifice, and for the sport of hunting. But Ashoka, having embraced the principle of compassion for all living beings, sought to reduce this killing and to promote kindness toward animals. He restricted the killing of certain animals, protected various creatures, and worked to reduce the slaughter of animals in his realm. This was a remarkable effort, an attempt to lessen the harm done to living things and to promote a more compassionate way of life among his people. Ashoka began this change with his own household and his own customs. The royal court had long consumed large numbers of animals, and hunting had been a favored sport of kings and princes, including Ashoka himself in his earlier years. But as his values changed, so did his habits. He reduced the killing of animals for the royal kitchen, cutting down the number of creatures slaughtered to feed the court. He gave up or greatly reduced the royal hunt, that ancient sport of kings that he had once enjoyed. These changes to his own way of life showed the sincerity of his transformation, his willingness to change even his own pleasures and customs in accordance with his beliefs. He did not merely urge others toward compassion while indulging himself, but changed his own conduct first. Ashoka spoke of these changes in his edicts, recording how he had reduced the killing of animals in his household and his realm. He described how the royal kitchen, which had once slaughtered many animals each day, now killed far fewer, and how he hoped to reduce this even further. He spoke of the animals he had protected and the killing he had restricted. These records show how seriously he took this concern and how it was reflected in real changes to the customs of his court and his empire. His compassion for animals was not merely a matter of words, but of action, of concrete changes to reduce the harm done to living creatures. He sought to lead by example, changing his own conduct as a model for his people. The giving up of the royal hunt was especially significant, for it represented a break with a deep and ancient tradition of kingship. The hunt had long been a favored pursuit of rulers, a display of their skill and their power, a source of pleasure and prestige. For Ashoka to give up or greatly reduce this sport, in accordance with his values, was a striking sign of the depth of his transformation. He was willing to set aside the pleasures and traditions of kingship in the service of his principles, to change even the customs that most rulers took for granted. This willingness to change his own conduct, even at the cost of pleasure and tradition, speaks to the sincerity and the depth of his commitment to the values he had embraced. The reduction of the killing of animals and the changing of the customs of the court reveal the sincerity of Ashoka's transformation. He did not merely proclaim principles of compassion while ignoring them in his own life. He lived by those principles, changing his own conduct and his own court in accordance with them. This integrity, this consistency between his words and his actions, marked him as a ruler of genuine conviction, truly transformed in his heart and his way of life. His compassion for all living things was real, expressed not only in his messages to his people, but in the concrete changes he made to his own way of living. Ashoka's devotion to the Buddha's way also led him to support the community of monks and the teachings themselves, playing a role in shaping the faith. Let us now turn to this role. As a devoted follower of the Buddha's way, Ashoka took an active role in supporting the community of Buddhist monks and in preserving and strengthening the teachings. He became a great patron of the faith, using his wealth and his power to support the monks and to promote the spread of the teachings. One of the important ways in which he is said to have supported the faith was through his role in a great gathering of Buddhist teachers, a council held to settle and preserve the teachings of the Buddha. Such gatherings were important moments in the history of the faith, times when the teachers came together to agree upon the true teachings and to resolve any disputes or differences that had arisen among them. The traditions tell that Ashoka supported and encouraged such a great council of monks during his reign. At this gathering, the teachers came together to settle the teachings, to agree upon what was true and correct, and to resolve differences that had arisen within the community. This was important work, for as the faith spread and grew, differences of understanding and practice could develop, and there was a need to preserve the true teachings and to maintain the unity of the community. By supporting such a council, Ashoka played a role in shaping and preserving the faith, helping to ensure that the teachings of the Buddha were maintained in their true form and passed on correctly to future generations. Ashoka's support for the community of monks went beyond this council. He was a generous patron of the faith, giving support to the monks and to the places where they lived and taught. He is said to have supported the building of monasteries and other religious structures, providing places for the monks to live and for the faithful to gather. He gave gifts and support to the community, using his wealth to promote the well-being of the faith and its followers. In these ways, he became one of the great patrons of Buddhism, a ruler whose support helped the faith to flourish and grow. His patronage was an important factor in the spread and the strength of Buddhism during his reign and afterward. The role of Ashoka as a protector and patron of Buddhism was significant for the history of the faith. His support gave the faith resources, prestige, and the backing of the most powerful ruler in the land. This helped Buddhism to grow and to spread, both within the empire and beyond. A faith supported by such a powerful patron could flourish in ways that would have been difficult otherwise. Ashoka's patronage thus played an important part in the development of Buddhism, helping it to become a major faith that would spread across much of Asia in the ages to come. His role as protector of the faith was one of the lasting contributions of his reign, one whose effects would be felt long after his own time. Ashoka's support for the community of monks and the preservation of the teachings shows how his personal transformation had become a force in the wider world. His embrace of the Buddha's way was not merely a private matter of belief, but a public commitment that shaped his rule and his use of his power. He used his position and his wealth to support and promote the faith, playing an active role in its preservation and spread. This support would have effects far beyond his own reign, contributing to the growth of Buddhism across Asia in the centuries that followed. And Ashoka's efforts to spread the faith did not stop at the borders of his empire. He sent messengers to distant lands and rulers, carrying the teachings of the Buddha far beyond his own realm. Let us now follow these missions to distant kings. One of the most remarkable aspects of Ashoka's transformed rule was his effort to spread the teachings of the Buddha beyond the borders of his own empire. to distant lands and rulers. Having embraced the way of peace and compassion, Ashoka wished to share it with others, not through conquest and force, but through the peaceful spreading of the teachings. He sent messengers and missions to faraway lands, carrying the message of the Buddha to distant peoples and kings. This was a striking thing for a ruler to do, to use his resources and his reach, not to expand his dominion, but to spread a message of peace and virtue. It reflected the depth of his commitment to the way he had embraced and his wish to share its benefits with the wider world. Ashoka's missions reached out in many directions, to lands near and far. He is said to have sent messengers to the lands of the south, beyond the borders of his empire, and to distant kingdoms in other directions. According to his own edicts, he even sent missions to faraway lands to the west, to the kingdoms that lay in the direction of the Mediterranean world, the successor states of the empire that Alexander had built. This was an astonishing reach, an effort to spread the teachings of the Buddha across enormous distances, to peoples and rulers in lands far removed from India. Whether these distant missions had great success we cannot always know, but the effort itself reveals the breadth of Ashoka's vision and his ambition to spread the way of peace far and wide. These missions were peaceful ones, carrying a message rather than an army. The messengers who went forth did not go to conquer or to demand submission, but to share the teachings of the Buddha and to promote the way of virtue and compassion. This was a new kind of ambition, utterly different from the conquering ambition of Ashoka's earlier years and of most rulers of his age. Where before he had sent armies to expand his empire, now he sent messengers to spread a message of peace. This transformation in the very nature of his ambition, from conquest to the peaceful spreading of virtue, reflected the deep change in his heart and values. He had turned the reach and the resources of his empire toward a wholly different purpose. The sending of these missions shows the wide horizon of Ashoka's vision. He did not think only of his own empire and his own people, but of the wider world beyond his borders. He wished to spread the way of peace and compassion to all peoples, near and far, to share the benefits of the teachings he had embraced. This universal vision, this concern for the well-being of people beyond his own realm, was a remarkable expression of his transformed values. It reflected the universal compassion of the Buddha's teaching, the concern for all living beings without regard to borders or nations. Ashoka's missions carried this universal vision out into the world, seeking to spread the way of peace as far as his reach could extend. The missions that Ashoka sent to distant lands would have lasting effects, contributing to the spread of Buddhism far beyond India. In the ages that followed, Buddhism would become a major faith across much of Asia, and the efforts of Ashoka to spread the teachings played an important part in this. His missions helped to plant the seeds of the faith in new lands, seeds that would grow and flourish in the centuries to come. Among all these missions, one in particular stands out for its importance and its success: the mission to the island now called Sri Lanka, led by Ashoka's own children. This was one of the great peaceful journeys of history, and it deserves our special attention. Let us now follow the journey to the island of Lanka. Among all the missions that Ashoka sent to spread the teachings of the Buddha, the most famous and successful was the one sent to the island now called Sri Lanka, which lies off the southern tip of India. This mission was led, according to the traditions, by Ashoka's own son Mahinda, the child born to him and Devi during his years, in the region of Ujjain. Mahinda had become a monk, devoting his life to the Buddha's way, and now he was sent to carry the teachings to the island kingdom to the south. This was a great and important mission. one that would plant the faith of the Buddha in new soil, where it would flourish for many centuries to come, down even to our own time. The journey to the island was a significant undertaking, carrying the mission across the water to a distant land with its own king and its own people. When Mahinda and his companions arrived, they came not as conquerors, but as bearers of a message, bringing the teachings of the Buddha to the island. According to the traditions, they met with the king of the island and shared with him the teachings of the Buddha. The king, moved by what he heard, embraced the faith, and through his acceptance, the teachings began to spread among the people of the island. This was a peaceful conquest of a very different kind, the winning of hearts and minds through the sharing of a message, rather than the winning of territory through force of arms. The planting of Buddhism in the island of Lanka was one of the great successes of Ashoka's missionary efforts. The faith took root there and flourished, becoming deeply established among the people. The island became a stronghold of the Buddha's teachings, preserving and passing them on through the ages. In time, the form of Buddhism established there would spread further to other lands, carrying the teachings even wider. The mission to Lanka, thus, had effects far beyond the island itself, contributing to the preservation and the spread of the faith across a wide region. It was one of the most important and lasting achievements of Ashoka's efforts to spread the way of peace, a mission whose fruits have endured for more than 2,000 years. That this great mission was led by Ashoka's own son gives it a special significance and poignancy. Mahinda, the child of Ashoka and Devi, had become a monk and now carried his father's faith to a distant land. The son, who might have been a prince and a warrior instead, became a bearer of peace, spreading the teachings of the Buddha rather than the power of the empire. This reflected the transformation of the whole family, the turning from the ways of conquest to the ways of peace. Ashoka's daughter, Sanghamitta, would also play a role in the mission to the island, as we shall see. The children of the emperor thus became agents of his transformed vision, carrying the way of peace across the sea to a new land. The mission to the island of Lanka stands as one of history's great peaceful journeys, a mission that carried not war and conquest, but a message of peace and compassion across the sea to a new land. It reflected the transformed vision of Ashoka, his wish to spread the way of the Buddha through peaceful means, and it achieved a lasting success that has endured for ages. The faith planted there by Mahinda and his companions flourished and grew, becoming a lasting part of the life of the island and spreading even further in time. Connected to this great mission is a beautiful legend, the story of a sacred tree carried across the sea to the island, a gift meant to last for ages. Let us now turn to this tender tale. Connected to the mission to the island of Lanka is one of the most beautiful and tender legends of Ashoka's reign, the story of the sacred tree carried across the sea. The tree in question was a branch of the sacred fig tree under which the Buddha was said to have attained his enlightenment. The tree, known as the Bodhi tree. This tree was among the most holy things in the Buddhist world, revered as the very place where the Buddha had found his great understanding. According to the traditions, a branch or a shoot of this sacred tree was carried to the island of Lanka to be planted there so that the sacred tree might grow in the new land where the faith had been planted. It was a gift of great meaning and reverence, meant to endure for ages. The one who carried this sacred branch to the island, according to the traditions, was Ashoka's own daughter, Sanghamitta. Like her brother Mahinda, Sanghamitta had devoted her life to the Buddha's way, becoming a nun. Now she undertook the sacred task of carrying the branch of the Bodhi tree across the sea to the island. so that it might be planted there. This was a task of great honor and importance, and it reflected the deep devotion of Ashoka's children to the faith. The daughter of the emperor, who might have lived a life of royal comfort, instead devoted herself to the way of the Buddha and undertook this sacred journey, carrying the holy tree to its new home in the distant island. The planting of the sacred tree in the island of Lanka was an event of great reverence and meaning. The tree, grown from the branch of the Bodhi tree under which the Buddha had attained enlightenment, was a living connection to the very origins of the faith. Planted in the new land, it became a holy object, revered by the people of the island as a sacred link to the Buddha himself. The tree is said to have grown and flourished, living for many ages, a lasting symbol of the faith planted in the island. According to the traditions, the sacred tree grown from that branch still lives today, more than 2,000 years later, one of the oldest living things connected to human history and reverence, a tender gift that has endured through all the long ages. There is something deeply moving about this legend of the sacred tree carried across the sea. It is a story of reverence and devotion, of a gift meant to last for ages, carried by a devoted daughter to a new land. It speaks of the tenderness and the care with which the faith was carried and planted, of the wish to give something precious and lasting to the people of the new land. The living tree, grown from a branch of the tree under which the Buddha had found his understanding, connected the new land to the very origins of the faith, a living link across time and distance. It was a gift of peace and reverence meant to endure, and according to the traditions, it has indeed endured through all the long centuries. The legend of the sacred tree brings warmth and reverence to the story of Ashoka and his efforts to spread the way of peace. It reflects the depth of the devotion that guided these efforts, the care and the tenderness with which the faith was carried to new lands. The tree, planted with reverence and enduring through the ages, stands as a symbol of the lasting effects of Ashoka's efforts, of the seeds of peace and faith that he helped to plant across the world. His transformation and his efforts to spread the way of the Buddha had effects that would endure for ages, reaching far beyond his own life and his own realm. Ashoka himself, in his devotion, also made journeys of his own, traveling to the holy places connected with the life of the Buddha. Let us now follow the pilgrim emperor. In his devotion to the Buddha's way, Ashoka undertook journeys of his own, traveling as a pilgrim to the holy places connected with the life of the Buddha. These were the sites where the great events of the Buddha's life had taken place, the place where he was born, the place where he attained enlightenment, the place where he first taught his message, and the place where he died. These sites were holy to the followers of the Buddha, revered as the places where the great teacher had lived and taught. Ashoka, as a devoted follower, wished to visit these holy places, to honor them, and to draw closer to the source of the faith he had embraced. His pilgrimages were expressions of his devotion, journeys undertaken in reverence and faith. Ashoka's pilgrimages took him to the important sites of the Buddha's life, and at these places he left marks of his devotion and his presence. He is said to have visited the place of the Buddha's birth, and there he raised a pillar and left an inscription recording his visit and honoring the holy site. This inscription, carved in stone, has survived to our own time, a lasting record of the emperor's pilgrimage and his reverence for the birthplace of the Buddha. At this and other holy sites, Ashoka left similar marks of his devotion, raising monuments and leaving inscriptions that recorded his visits and honored the places connected with the Buddha's life. These marks show the depth of his devotion and his wish to honor the sacred places of his faith. The pilgrimages of Ashoka reflected the personal depth of his transformation and his faith. He did not merely support the faith from a distance, through patronage and the sending of missions, but engaged with it personally, undertaking journeys of devotion to its holy places. This personal engagement shows how deeply the faith had become a part of his life, how sincerely he had embraced the way of the Buddha. The emperor, who had once marched to war, now traveled as a humble pilgrim to the holy places of his faith, honoring them with reverence and devotion. This transformation, from warrior to pilgrim, captures in a single image the profound change that had come over Ashoka, the turning from the ways of power and conquest to the ways of faith and peace. At the holy places he visited, Ashoka also undertook works to honor and to mark them, raising monuments and making improvements. He is said to have honored the sites connected with the Buddha's life, marking them and adorning them so that they might be properly revered. Through these works, he helped to establish and to preserve the holy places of the faith, ensuring that they would be honored and remembered. This was part of his broader role as a patron and protector of the faith, using his resources to support and promote it. His pilgrimages thus served not only his own personal devotion, but also the wider cause of the faith, helping to establish and preserve the holy places that would be revered by the faithful for ages to come. The image of Ashoka as a pilgrim, traveling to the holy places of his faith in reverence and devotion, is a fitting one for a ruler so transformed. It shows us a man who had truly embraced a new way of life, who engaged with his faith personally and sincerely, and who used his power and his resources to honor and preserve the things he held sacred. The pilgrim emperor, walking the holy paths of his faith, embodies the peace and the devotion that had come to define his life. But even as Ashoka lived out his transformed vision, promoting the way of peace and honoring his faith, the shadows of age and sorrow were gathering around him. His later years would bring their own trials and griefs, the sorrows that come to all people, even the greatest, as their lives draw toward their close. Let us now turn to the shadows of his later years. As Ashoka grew old, the shadows of age and sorrow gathered around him, bringing trials and griefs to the later years of his remarkable life. The great emperor, who had ruled for many years and had transformed himself and his empire, now faced the sorrows that come to all people as they age, the losses and the weakening that mark the closing of a life. His later years were touched by melancholy, by the grief of loss and the fading of his strength. This part of his story is a quieter and sadder one, the tale of a great life moving toward its close, marked by the sorrows that even the most powerful cannot escape. It is a reminder that all people, however great, must face the trials of age and mortality. The old traditions tell of sorrows that touched Ashoka's later years, including losses within his own family. He is said to have suffered the loss of loved ones, griefs that weighed heavily upon his aging heart. The queen who had been dear to him, and others close to him, are said to have passed from his life, leaving him to mourn. These personal losses added to the melancholy of his later years, the sorrows of an old man who had outlived some of those he loved. Even an emperor, surrounded by the grandeur of his court, could not escape the griefs of loss that come with a long life. Ashoka, in his later years, tasted these sorrows, mourning those he had lost and feeling the weight of his years. Along with these personal griefs came the fading of his strength and his powers. Ashoka had ruled for many years, a long and eventful reign, and now age was taking its toll. His body grew weaker, his energy fading as the years pressed upon him. The vigor that had carried him through his conquests and his transformation and his great works was slipping away, as it does for all people in their later years. This fading of strength was its own kind of sorrow, the diminishing of a once mighty ruler, the slow decline that comes at the end of a long life. Ashoka faced this decline as all people must, feeling the weakening of his body and the approach of the end of his days. There are also traditions that speak of difficulties in his later years concerning his hold on power and the affairs of his court and family. As an aging ruler, his grip on the affairs of the empire may have weakened, and there may have been tensions and troubles concerning the succession and the future of his rule. The old stories tell of various difficulties and sorrows in these later years, painting a picture of a great ruler whose final years were touched by trouble and melancholy. Whatever the exact truth of these traditions, they suggest that Ashoka's later years were not entirely peaceful and happy, but were marked by the trials and sorrows that often come at the close of a long and eventful life. The shadows of Ashoka's later years remind us of the human reality behind the great figure of history. He was, in the end, a man like other men, subject to the sorrows of loss and the trials of age. His later years brought their own griefs and difficulties, the melancholy of a great life drawing toward its close. This quieter and sadder chapter of his story adds depth and humanity to our picture of him, reminding us that even the greatest of rulers must face the common trials of mortal life. As his life moved toward its end, Ashoka would face these final years with what strength and grace he could muster, continuing in his devotion and his good works, even as his powers faded. Let us now follow the fading of the old emperor toward the close of his remarkable life. In his final years, Ashoka continued in his devotion and his good works, even as his strength faded and his life drew toward its close. Though age and sorrow weighed upon him, he remained committed to the way he had embraced, continuing to support the faith and to promote the values that had come to guide his life. The old traditions tell of his continued generosity in these final years, of his giving to the community of monks and to the faith. Even as his powers faded, his devotion remained, and he sought to continue his good works to the end. This continued commitment, even in the face of age and decline, shows the depth and the sincerity of his transformation, which endured to the very end of his life. The traditions tell of Ashoka's great generosity in his final years, of how he gave freely to the faith and its followers. Some stories tell of him giving away so much of his wealth to the community of monks that those around him sought to restrain him, concerned that he was giving away too much of the treasury. Whether or not these tales are exactly true, they reflect the memory of an emperor whose devotion led him to great generosity, giving freely of his wealth in the service of his faith. Even in his final years, weakened and aging, his commitment to the way he had embraced remained strong, expressed in his continued giving and his continued support for the faith and its followers. As his final years passed, Ashoka's hold on the affairs of the empire continued to weaken, as it does for all rulers in their old age. The vigorous emperor, who had commanded armies and transformed his realm, was now an old man, his strength failing, his grip on power loosening. The affairs of the empire increasingly passed into other hands, as is natural when a ruler grows old and weak. Ashoka, in these final years, was a diminished figure compared to the mighty emperor of his prime, softened and weakened by age. Yet even in this decline, the marks of his transformation remained, his devotion and his generosity enduring to the end. The softening of the once mighty ruler was not only a physical decline, but also, in a sense, the final flowering of the gentleness that had come to define him. There is a poignancy to these final years, the image of the great emperor grown old and weak, his strength fading, his power slipping away, yet still devoted to the way of peace he had embraced. The conqueror who had shaken the world with his armies, the ruler who had transformed his empire and sent messengers of peace across distant lands, was now an old man nearing the end of his days. All the power and the glory of his prime had faded, leaving behind a gentle and devoted old ruler, generous to his faith and committed to his values to the last. This image of the softened and fading emperor, still true to his transformation in his final years, is a fitting close to the story of his remarkable life. The fading of the old emperor brought his long and eventful life toward its natural end. He had lived a life of extraordinary change and achievement, rising from an overlooked prince to a mighty conqueror, and then transforming himself into a seeker of peace and a promoter of virtue. Now, in his final years, that long journey was drawing to its close, the great life fading gently toward its end. Ashoka had done much, changed much, and left a lasting mark upon his world. As his final years passed and his strength continued to fade, the time of his death approached, the end of a truly remarkable life. Let us now turn to the death of the emperor who chose peace, and the mourning that followed across his empire. At last, after a long and remarkable life, Ashoka came to the end of his days. The great emperor, who had ruled for many years and had transformed himself and his empire, passed from the world, his long journey finally complete. The old traditions do not give us a detailed account of his death, but we know that after his long reign and his eventful life, he died an old man, his strength faded, and his time come to an end. The mighty ruler who had shaken the world and then turned to the way of peace passed quietly from life, as all people must in the end. His death marked the close of one of the most remarkable lives in all of history, the end of the emperor who chose peace. The death of Ashoka would have been mourned across his vast empire, for he had been a ruler of great importance and, in his later years, of great compassion. The people of his realm, who had lived under his rule and had received the benefits of his care and his good works, would have grieved at the passing of their emperor. The community of monks and the followers of the faith, whom he had supported so generously, would have mourned the loss of their great patron and protector. Across the wide lands of the empire, from the great capital to the distant provinces, the news of the emperor's death would have spread, bringing grief and mourning to the people who had lived under his long and eventful reign. Ashoka's death marked the passing of a truly rare and remarkable king. In all of history, few rulers have undergone such a profound transformation as he did, turning from a fierce conqueror into a seeker of peace and a promoter of virtue. Few have used their power so fully in the service of compassion and the welfare of their people. Few have left such a lasting mark through the promotion of peace rather than the waging of war. Ashoka was truly a rare kind of ruler, one whose greatness lay not in his conquests, but in his transformation. Not in the wars he won, but in the peace he chose. His death was the passing of a king unlike almost any other, a ruler remembered not for his power, but for his compassion. As we reflect on the death of Ashoka, we may consider the extraordinary arc of his life, from the overlooked prince to the mighty conqueror to the seeker of peace. He had known great power and great glory, and he had known great sorrow and great remorse. He had shed blood and caused suffering, and he had turned from these to promote compassion and ease suffering. He had built an empire of conquest and then sought to make it an empire of virtue. His life encompassed both darkness and light, both the horror of Kalinga and the compassion of his later years. In his death, this remarkable arc came to its close, the long journey of a soul that had traveled from conquest to peace, finally complete. The death of Ashoka brought to an end his personal story, but not the story of his legacy and his influence. Though the man had passed, the effects of his life and his transformation would endure. His edicts, carved in stone, would remain, speaking his message to future ages. The faith he had supported and spread would continue to grow, reaching across much of Asia in the centuries to come. And his example, the example of a conqueror who chose peace, would inspire and move people for ages to come. But in the more immediate aftermath of his death, the empire he had ruled would face its own decline and fall, slipping away in the years that followed. Let us now turn to the fate of the empire after Ashoka, the empire that slipped away. After the death of Ashoka, the great Mauryan empire that he had ruled began to decline and fall apart. The empire that his grandfather had built and that he had held and transformed did not long survive his passing in its full strength and glory. In the years and decades after his death, the empire weakened, its distant parts breaking away, its power fading. The rulers who came after Ashoka were not able to hold the vast realm together as he and his predecessors had done, and gradually the great empire crumbled and fell apart. The mighty realm that had stretched across the subcontinent, one of the greatest empires the world had known, slipped away into history, its unity and its power fading with the passing of the years. There were many reasons for the decline of the empire after Ashoka. A realm so vast and so varied was always difficult to hold together, requiring strong and capable rulers and constant effort. The rulers who followed Ashoka lacked his greatness and were not able to maintain the empire in its full strength. The distant provinces, always hard to control, broke away as central power weakened. Pressures from within and without wore at the empire, and its unity dissolved. The great machinery of government that had held the realm together loosened its grip, and the empire fragmented into smaller states. Within a period after Ashoka's death, the great Mauryan Empire had effectively come to an end, its unity broken and its power dispersed. The fall of the Mauryan Empire shows how quickly earthly power can fade, even the greatest and most impressive. The empire that had seemed so mighty, that had stretched across a subcontinent and commanded vast armies and treasuries, did not endure for long after the passing of its greatest ruler. The power and the glory that Ashoka and his forebears had built up crumbled and dispersed, leaving behind fragments where once there had been a mighty whole. This is the fate that has come to many great empires throughout history, a reminder of how fleeting worldly power can be. The mighty Mauryan realm, for all its greatness, slipped away into history, its power fading as new powers rose in its place. Yet the fading of the empire helps us to understand where Ashoka's true legacy lay. His greatness, in the end, was not in the empire he ruled, for that empire soon fell apart after his death. His true legacy lay elsewhere, in the transformation he had undergone, in the values he had promoted, in the faith he had spread, and in the example he had set. These endured long after the empire had crumbled. The empire was earthly power, and earthly power fades. But the example of a conqueror who chose peace, the message of compassion carved in stone, the faith spread across distant lands, these proved more enduring than the empire itself. Ashoka's true monument was not his realm, but his transformation and its effects, which would outlast the empire by many ages. The empire that slipped away after Ashoka's death reminds us that his greatness lay not in his worldly power, but in the deeper and more lasting things he achieved. The empire fell, as empires do, but the memory and the example of Ashoka would prove far more enduring. Indeed, though his empire fell, and his name was in time forgotten for many centuries, he would one day be rediscovered and honored anew, becoming a symbol of the modern nation of India and an inspiration to people around the world. The story of how Ashoka was forgotten and then reborn in memory is a remarkable one, a fitting close to the tale of this extraordinary ruler. Let us now turn to this final chapter, the Emperor reborn in memory. The final and perhaps most remarkable turn in the story of Ashoka came long after his death, in the way he was forgotten and then rediscovered across the vast span of time. For many centuries after his empire fell, the memory of Ashoka faded from history. The details of his life and his reign were lost. His edicts stood unread as the ancient scripts in which they were written were forgotten, and the great emperor who had chosen peace became a shadowy and half-remembered figure, known mainly through legends preserved by the faithful. The mighty ruler who had transformed himself and spread the way of peace was, in a sense, lost to history, his true greatness forgotten, his voice silenced by the passing of the ages. Then, in more recent centuries, Ashoka was rediscovered. Scholars studying the ancient monuments of India came upon the edicts carved in stone, the messages that Ashoka had left for his people and for future ages. At first, these could not be read, for the ancient scripts had been forgotten. But through patient work, scholars managed to decipher the ancient writing, unlocking the meaning of the edicts. And as they read the words that Ashoka had left, they began to understand who he had been and what he had done. The voice of Ashoka, silent for so many centuries, spoke again through his edicts, telling of his transformation, his sorrow over Kalinga, and his commitment to the way of peace and virtue. The forgotten emperor was rediscovered, his true greatness revealed at last. As Ashoka was rediscovered and his story became known, he came to be honored and celebrated as one of the greatest rulers in all of history. His transformation from conqueror to seeker of peace, his promotion of compassion and virtue, his tolerance and his care for his people, all of these came to be admired and revered. He became a symbol of the ideal of a ruler, guided by conscience and compassion, an inspiration to people seeking a better and more peaceful world. In the modern nation of India, he came to be honored as a great figure of the past, a symbol of the country's heritage and its values. The lion capital that he had raised was chosen as the national emblem, and a wheel from his pillars was placed upon the national flag, connecting the modern nation to the ancient emperor. The rebirth of Ashoka in memory is a fitting close to his remarkable story. The emperor who chose peace, forgotten for centuries, was rediscovered and honored anew, his true greatness recognized at last. His message, carved in stone so long ago, reached across the ages to speak to new generations, and his example inspired people seeking peace and compassion in their own time. His true legacy, which lay not in his empire, but in his transformation and his values, proved more enduring than the empire itself, outlasting it by many ages and reaching down even to our own day. The conqueror who wept after victory, who who turned from war to peace, became at last a symbol of the highest ideals of rule, honored across the world. And so, we come to the end of our long journey through the life of Ashoka, the emperor who chose peace. We have followed him from his birth as an overlooked prince, through his rise to power and his terrible conquest of Kalinga, to his profound transformation and his life of compassion and virtue, and finally to his death and his rebirth in memory across the ages. It has been the story of a remarkable soul, one who traveled from darkness to light, from conquest to peace. Let us leave him now in a moment of quiet stillness. Picture one of his great stone pillars standing alone in the fading light of evening, its polished surface catching the last soft glow of the sun as it sinks toward the horizon. The carved lions at its top gaze out over a peaceful land, and the words upon its surface speak gently of kindness and compassion, as they have for more than 2,000 years. Around it, the land grows quiet as night comes on, the birds settling in the trees, the air growing cool and still. The pillar stands as it has stood through all the long ages, a silent witness to the emperor who chose peace, enduring quietly into the gathering dark. Thank you for spending this time with us, and for letting the story of this gentle emperor carry you toward rest. May you find your own peace tonight, as quiet and as deep as the stillness that surrounds that ancient pillar in the fading light. Rest well, dear listeners, and sleep in peace.